Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the Black Swordsman Part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see Part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Draskir from AO3. So let's start the video. Beginning of the Storm chapter text. All men are not created equal. This was the harsh reality that I, Midoriya Izuku, learned at the ripe age of 4. You don't do 𝗕𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗂𝗂𝗁. I whimpered, fists raised. I might have looked a bit threatening if I weren't shaking like a leaf, tiny strips of electricity crackling up and down my tiny arms. Between my trembling and stuttering, I was pretty much the opposite of a threat. In front of me, my friend 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁, or Kakin as I called her, grinned fairly, cracking her knuckles and letting off a small explosion. Flanked on either side by her 2 lackeys, who were both giggling to themselves over my defiance, I was staring down impossible odds. Are you still trying to play hero, Deku? Kakin said evenly, taking a step forward threateningly. I just whimpered in response, screwing my eyes shut and taking another step back in fear. Before I even realized what had happened, I was flat on my back, aching all over and staring up into the sky. The boy I had tried to protect had probably run off, and my trio of tormentors had wandered off in search of other excitement. With an electrical quirk that can barely power a light bulb, and a shy, timid personality, I just wasn't suited for fights like this. All men are not created equal. As I grew older, I started getting a grasp on my quirk. That didn't do much to stop Kakin from picking on and bullying me. I remember when she was just a confident and outgoing girl, but getting her quirk and being surrounded by coddling adults grew that confidence into arrogance. In the span of just a couple months, my best friend changed into a completely different person. I followed her less and less as the years passed, growing more and more introverted and keeping to myself. Never feeling confident in my social skills, I stuck to analyzing heroes and their quirks, practicing with my own quirk, and playing video games in my spare time. With a bit of exploration, I found 𝗳𝗏𝗵𝗆 Beach, where ocean trash accumulated frequently. People often used this as a cover for their illegal dumping, but it was a great place for me to practice with my quirk in private. My quirk, electrokinesis, let me manipulate electricity however I wanted. Different hand motions had different effects as I discharged electricity, but too much at once had me drained pretty quickly. As much as I can manipulate it, I was not able to generate electricity myself. Draining myself too fast left me with a gnarly headache. And submerging myself in water would electrocute me in spite of my resistance to the crackly currents. As the years passed by, my training, games, and analysis were the main focus of all my spare time. My mom was a worrywart, but as long as I kept my grades up, she wasn't particularly restrictive with my freedom. That all changed, of course, when the hotly anticipated VR MMO, Sword Art Online, was finally released. In what was probably the luckiest moment of my life thus far, I was chosen to beta test the game in the 2 months leading up to its release, alongside only 1,000 other players. Only the beta testers were given the chance to pre-order 𝗬𝗏, and only 10,000 copies of the game were sold at all. Using the 𝗕𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏, a gaming helmet that transports the player's conscious directly into the game world, 𝗬𝗏 was shaping up to be one of the most immersive games ever released. At noon on the day of launch, I logged into the 𝗬𝗏 game server. It would be more than 2 years before I could log out again. I don't really remember much of how it ended, I admitted, scratching the back of my head. The fight, I mean. The detective sitting next to my hospital bed offered a patient smile as he waited for me to collect my thoughts. It had been a week since my final battle with 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗁, and finally logging everyone out of 𝗬𝗏. Most of the past week had been spent doing tests and visiting with my family, but today I was being visited by a detective working the 𝗬𝗏 case. Anything you can remember would be helpful, no matter how small, the detective, 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁, offered with a smile. I'd already told him that I was present for the final battle, but I hadn't yet revealed my specific role. Given the circumstances, I didn't really want to, but it may surprise you. I started slowly, carefully choosing my words, to learn that the game's strongest player, 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗁, was 𝗕𝗏𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 in disguise. I let out a small breath as the detective jolted in surprise. Called it. I didn't give him time to respond. However, I'd suspected for a while, but I figured it out after the boss raid on the 75th floor. When I confronted him, he didn't bother denying or trying to hide it. I paused for a moment to let 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 catch up with his notes. As soon as his pen stopped, I marshaled on. He used his admin privileges to paralyze every player in the room. I let out, raking my hand through my long green hair. Except for me. The detective paused in his notes at that. Why you, as a reward for figuring out his secret early. I tried to keep my tone as even possible, but it made my heart pound in my chest just thinking about it. 𝗧𝗏𝗁𝗁𝗁 frowned at that and made a note on his pad. He offered to let me fight him, for the chance to beat the game early. And you took him up on that offer, 𝗧𝗵𝗁 said quietly. I guess it was pretty obvious. I offered up a pained smile, my eyes halfway hidden by my 2 long bangs. I had to, I sighed tiredly. Risk my life for the chance to end the death game early. Sounds great to me. Also scary. Very, very scary. Well, all of the surviving victims are awake, 𝗧𝗵𝗁 commented after a beat of silence. Your risk appears to have paid off. I looked up at the detective, surprise written on my face. You actually believe me? 𝗧𝗵𝗁 offered a small, sly smile. My quirk is called lie detector. I'm sure you can figure out what that means. I snorted, leaning back quietly as he finished his notes. You'll keep your end of the bargain, right? Of course. You've been more than helpful. I'll find your friends for you. I'll be in touch when I have something for you. Rest up, Midoriya-kun. 𝗧𝗵𝗁 placed a business card on the side table, then stood to leave. I waved after him, then laid back down. My eyes screwed shut from discomfort. Even just sitting up was still too much on this weak body. Months passed. It was December when I was finally let out of the hospital, a month after waking up. Most of that month was spent doing physical therapy, and I was on crutches by the time they let me go. Stepping back into my bedroom for the first time in 2 years left me with a sense of nostalgia, and the lack of dust told me that Mom was keeping it taken care of in my absence. I was off the crutches by the time school started in April. True to his word, 𝗧𝗵𝗁 managed to put me in contact with my friends from 𝗬𝗏. None of them went to my school, sadly, but they were all close enough to visit on days off. My weekly visit to 𝗬𝗪𝐻𝗪𝐻 cafe had quickly become the highlight of every week. Unfortunately, it was the only highlight. Turned out, my body wasn't the only thing that had atrophied. My quirk is functionally useless after over 2 years of dormancy, and I had no time to build it back up. With all the extra school work I'd been given, I had 2 full years of work to catch up on. Most of the kids from 𝗬𝗏 were sent to a specialized school to get them caught up, but it was too far away for my attendance to be viable. 𝗎𝗪𝙢 Middle School, where I went before, offered a backup plan. I'd be given extra work and study materials to catch up on the years I missed, side by side with the studying done with my peers. There was a lot of work to do, and I would be swamped, but I wouldn't have to be held back if I managed to keep up. My return to school itself was uneventful, mostly just half-hearted welcomes from my old classmates. Bakugo Katsuki looked at me like I'd grown a second head the first time she saw me, but otherwise ignored me. The sound of a tray coming down on the table caught my attention. I looked up to see none other than Bakugo taking a seat across from me, eyes pointed down at her food. Shit nerd, Bakugo muttered in a low voice, still not looking at me. Holding up all right. I blinked. Bakugo, being civil? This was new. See for yourself, I said, shaking off my confusion as I gestured at the worksheet in front of me. I have to work through every meal, or I can't keep up. Bakugo just grunted and went back to her food. I put her out of my mind and focused on my work. The rest of the lunch period passed by in silence. Choosing what high school you will attend is, of course, a heavy and important decision. I glanced up from my sheet to see our homeroom teacher looking dark and serious as he considered the stack of papers in his hands. Like the drop of a hat, though, his expression turned all bright and joyful. Oh, who am I kidding? You'll all be trying for the heroics course, right? He beamed at the class as it erupted into loud cheers. Of course, everyone wanted to be heroes. It's the society we grew up in, especially with heroes like All Might doing his work. Sensei, don't lump me in with all these side characters. Total silence. Bakugo, of course, was leaning back in her chair, feet propped up on her desk, shit-eating grin plastered on her face. I rolled my eyes and went back to my worksheet. Oh, Bakugo. Sensei looked down at his stack of papers. You wanted to try for UA, right? Cue eruption of surprise and gossip. Not surprising, given that UA accepts roughly 0.25% of all applicants. Bakugo, of course, ate it all up like a ham, leaping up to stand on her desk. I aced the mock test, she boasted, beating her fist against her chest. I'm the only one at this school that could possibly get into the National School of Heroics. Oh, Midoriya, you want to try for UA too, huh? My pen stopped, and I could almost hear something inside Bakugo crack as everyone else in the room turned to stare at me. I kept my face blank even as my heart started pounding in my chest at the sudden attention. Slowly, Bakugo turned her steely gaze in my direction, hell written on her feature as I pointedly did not return her gaze. Deku, she growled darkly as murmurs and gossip circulate for the second time in the last few minutes. I grimaced for a moment, then put on an obviously forced polite smile. Yes, Bakugo-san. I acknowledged her quietly, addressing her by name for the first time since my return to school. Her eyes widened and she almost recoiled at the name drop. She kept her composure, though, and just turned to drop back in her seat with a huff, dismissing me without a word for the rest of class. I kept an eye on her, though. Once Bakugo's fire had been kindled, it wouldn't go out so easy. The end of class came both too quickly, and not quickly enough. I packed up my stuff a moment early so I could beat a hasty retreat, but a hand on my shoulder stopped me before I could get out the door. Damn it. I turned and saw Bakugo staring at me with a blank face, but anger was clearly visible in her eyes. The rest of the class emptied out of the room, and my heart began pounding in my chest again. "Can I help you with something, Bakugo-san?" I asked politely, silently dreading the coming wrath. Bakugo's grip on my shoulder tightened. "What the fuck are you playing at, Deku?" Bakugo snarled, her face dropping into feral anger. "Are you really still fucking dreaming after all this time? You can't be a hero." Her grip on my shoulder tightened even more, and smoke began pouring up through her fingers. I could feel the heat through my clothes, so I pushed her hand off before she could properly burn me. "What makes you think that?" I asked, my voice wavering, not giving Bakugo a chance to get angry at the resistance. It was a struggle to keep myself composed in the face of my childhood tormentor and ex-best friend. Bakugo scoffed at that. "Your quirk is useless. What can you do with it except fucking spark off?" She crossed her arms, grinning mirthlessly to herself. She probably thought she had me cornered. "I can do plenty with it. I just have to build it back up." Bakugo's grin dropped at that. "And when do you plan to do that, shit nerd?" she asked, sneering at me. "All the extra catch-up work you have, you'll be lucky to get into high school at all. You'll never have time for your fucking quirk, Deku." I shot a glare at her, fierce as I could manage. It probably wasn't very good, considering my nerves, but Bakugo still recoiled with wide eyes. "Then I'll get in without it," I snapped, my eyes narrowing. "You don't need a quirk to be dangerous, Bakugo-san." I turned and left without another word, ignoring the loud Deku behind me. It made me angry, but I really couldn't be surprised. Bakugo had been trying to stop me from being a hero ever since we were 4, just because she didn't think my quirk was useful. It was hard to blame her for that, though, when every adult around us would praise her quirk more than anything else. Growing up, I never held it against her, even when she spent most of our time together bullying me. I didn't intend to be so easygoing about it now, though, thanks to Asuna. It took her a while, but she convinced me of how bad it was to just look the other way when it came to Bakugo's behavior. I let out an aggravated groan as I stepped into an underpass on my way home. Just stop thinking about it. I couldn't let Bakugo or anyone else get in the way of my dream. With or without my quirk, I was going to get into UA, even if Bakugo wanted to kill me over it. I came to a stop as my phone vibrated in my pocket. Probably Asuna, checking in like usual. Before I had a chance to check it, though, a sloshing sound at my feet stopped me short. I looked down sharply to see a mass of slime pouring up out of the sewer grate. My mind began racing as I tried to backpedal away, but with my weakened body, I wasn't able to get away before it caught me. As the slime enveloped my body and forced itself into my mouth and nostrils, a pair of unnatural-looking eyes opened up to stare at me, an invisible shield. Its voice was deep and watery. "You don't look like much, but it's better than nothing." A mouth formed in the slime, and it seemed to grin at me as I clawed at the sludge. "Don't worry, it'll only hurt for a minute." The slime laughed as my lungs began to burn. "I can't breathe." I struggled against the slime hopelessly, and just as my vision started to go out, a distinct laugh rang out through the underpass. "Have no fear, young man. I am here." All might. Darkness took over as I passed out from lack of air. Shit. Of course the villain had taken a child hostage. Yagi Toshinori had chased the slime villain into the sewers, where they had played a game of cat and mouse. Unsurprisingly, sewer water was a great camouflage for a person made from slime. Toshinori would berate himself for this mistake later. For now, though, have no fear, young man. I am here. The slime villain snarled and shot out a tendril, but Toshinori was able to duck underneath easily enough. A low-level villain like this would be easy to dispatch. Texas. Toshinori reared back a fist, sizing up a good spot to blow away the villain without hurting its hostage. Without missing a beat, he let fly the air cannon that was his punch. Smash. Air pressure was catapulted down the length of the tunnel. And though the slime struggled to fight against the current, it succumbed to the blast and burst into many small piles of goo. The child, now free of his captor, fell to the ground in a heap. With a sigh and a cursory check of his surroundings, Toshinori moved the child out of the tunnel and into the sun, and checked his vital signs. "Seems to be all right," Toshinori muttered to himself, letting his ever-present smile drop and glowering at himself for a moment. He could be self-deprecating about it later. For now, there was a villain to contain. Pursing his lips, Toshinori dumped out his drinks into the sewer and began the arduous task of packing the slime into the emptied bottles. Just as he was finishing up, the young man began to stir, and Toshinori let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As the young man sat up, Toshinori knelt down in front of him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Young man," he said firmly, putting his smile back on. "Are you all right?" It took a moment before he even noticed Toshinori. When he did, though, his eyes were like saucers, and he scrambled backwards a fair few feet. "All might," he practically screamed, his voice high-pitched with wonder. What are you doing here? Toshinori stood back up, placing his fists on his hips theatrically. Sorry about letting you get caught up in my fight. I don't normally make mistakes like that. He scratched his head sheepishly, letting out a hearty laugh. Thanks for distracting him, though. I was able to capture him because of that. The boy said nothing in response, eyes swirling and nervous sounds emanating. And Toshinori worried inwardly that he might have broken the lad. His mind appeared to catch up with him after a moment, as he began to dig around in his backpack in a mad frenzy, muttering about something to write on. Finally, the boy wordlessly presented Toshinori with a notebook and pen, and the hero realized what he wanted. A fan, Toshinori accepted the items with a hearty laugh, and flipped through to find an empty page. It took him a minute to find one, as most of the pages were filled with notes and data about many heroes he recognized, and some that he didn't, leaving an autograph and small drawing in the first empty page he found. Toshinori handed the items back to his fan. I see you have an eye for analysis, young man, he commented. The boy held his notebook to his chest, a small blush dusting his cheeks. Toshinori laughed again as he turned to leave. Well then, I must be off. Gotta get this guy to the police station, after all. Wait, it was so quiet, Toshinori almost couldn't hear it. I'm afraid I can't, he stated as he prepared to jump. Pro heroes are always fighting against enemies, and time. Without looking back, Toshinori primed himself and leaped high into the air, calling a farewell back to the young man as he went. As he scanned the area, looking for the local police station, he noticed that his leg felt heavier than it should have. Looking down, Toshinori's eyes bugged out as he saw the young man holding on for dear life, lips and eyelids comically stretched out. What the hell? Oi, this is too much, kid. Without thinking, Toshinori tried to push him off. Stop. If I let go now, I'll die. Toshinori stopped, nearly slapping himself. Of course, the kid was right. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed the boy's collar and held on, aiming himself at the nearest building. As if things couldn't get worse, the top hero coughed and felt a drop of blood slide out the corner of his mouth. Shit, what the hell was I thinking? In a desperate move, I had grabbed onto All Might's leg as he jumped away. As he had turned to leave, I could only think of the things I wanted to ask him. I don't know what I had expected, but it certainly wasn't suddenly being hundreds of feet in the air and wind peeling my face from my skull. Of course, All Might is a skilled, top hero. Landing was an easy enough thing for him to manage, even if it was a bit rough. I almost died. I was on all fours, gasping for air. That was too reckless of you, young man, All Might scolded, shaking his head as he turned to leave yet again. Wait, I called after him, surging to my feet, hand outstretched towards him. No, I will not, All Might stated firmly. I am seriously out of time. I watched as my idol prepared to jump again, my heart pounding in my chest. Memories flashed in the back of my mind, and my hand lowered. Bakugo screaming that I couldn't be a hero. Flynn's regret as he rushed back to join his clan at the start of 𝗬. Asuna's determination to return to the real world. Lisbeth asking to hold my hand as we slept in the dragon's den. My eyes screwed shut and my breath hitched in my throat as one last image appeared in the forefront of my mind. Thank you. Goodbye, 𝗬𝗁. My eyes opened wide, and tears threatened to fall as I remembered that day. Can I be a hero like you? I cried out, my vision hazy. I barely registered that All Might actually stopped to listen. Even if my quirk never comes back, can I still be a hero and help people? My eyes screwed shut and I clamped in on myself. Never comes back, All Might asked after a beat of silence. It's because I'm in 𝗬 Survivor, I sighed, opening my eyes to stare down at the ground. I spent 2 years in that game, and my body became weak. My quirk is barely functional. I'd tried to be strong about it in front of Bakugo, but even I had my doubts. My friends from 𝗬 flashed through my mind again, and I thought about all the people who died fighting for their freedom. I stared down at my hand, watching little strips of electricity crackle in my palms. Even so, I still want to be a hero. A lot of people died in 𝗬, and I want to honor their memory. I finally worked up the courage to look at All Might again, only to be met with a cloud of smoke billowing away. I stared in shock, thinking for a moment that my idol had simply left when I wasn't paying attention. After a moment, though, the smoke faded to reveal an emaciated husk. I stepped back subconsciously as the husk stared back with a seemingly resigned look. 𝗬𝗏 All Might 𝗔𝗂𝘁. A beat of silence. Then, I am All Might, said the husk, immediately coughing up a fistful of blood. I was tempted to offer my handkerchief, but this turn of events had me too shocked to even think of moving. And no way, I exclaimed, my mind racing. How the hell did this happen to you? My blood ran cold as the emaciated All Might lifted up his shirt to reveal a very nasty-looking scar, one that seemed to cover almost a third of his torso. I received this from an enemy's attack 5 years ago, All Might stated evenly, then let his shirt fall back into place. I've become emaciated from repeated surgeries and their after effects. Now, I can only work as a hero for 3 hours a day. So that's why. I'd been noticing a downward trend of work done by 𝗕𝗵𝗃 since I woke up, and he was gone from the public for a while. 5 years ago, so this lined up. 5 years ago, I inquired, trying to channel my inner Argo. Do you mean the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? You're well informed. 𝗕𝗵𝗃 chuckled lightly, then turned serious again. No, a punk like the chainsaw couldn't put a scratch on me. This was something else, something I asked to be kept secret. The world needs their symbol of peace, and so I can't let anyone see what I've become. 𝗕𝗵𝗃 sighed and leaned against the railing for support. Young man, your reason to be a hero is something to be admired. But can you do it without your quirk? No, I'd have to say. Pro heroes are always risking their lives. My blood ran cold again as I listened to 𝗕𝗵𝗃 speak. I could feel myself trembling at his words, even as a part of me wanted to argue. If you want to help people, 𝗕𝗵𝗃 said as he pushed off the railing and made for the door, you could try and be a doctor or a police officer. The latter may be made fun of for having villains dropped on their front door, but both are fine occupations. The door to the stairwell clicked shut, and I stood rooted to the spot as I tried to work my nerves under control. A top pro said that I couldn't be a hero. I buried my face in my hands, unable to even think, barely able to breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, but an explosion in the distance caught my attention. A villain attack, I mumbled to myself. Eventually, I dragged myself to the stairs. That explosion had been the direction 𝗕𝗵𝗃 and I had come from. As my mind wandered over the day's events, I thought about Bakugo, 𝗕𝗵𝗃, and the slime villain. By the time I reached the street, I had a very bad feeling in the back of my mind. You can't be a hero, Deku. I flipped through the pages of my notebook, glancing at each page, but not really absorbing anything. As I wandered down the street aimlessly, I reached the page that 𝗕𝗵𝗃 had autographed for me. But can you do it without your quirk? No, I'd have to say. I sighed miserably and closed the notebook, stowing it away in my backpack. Part of me wanted to fight back, to argue with the idea that you need a quirk to be a hero, but another part of me just wanted to quietly accept it. Maybe 𝗕𝗵𝗃 was right. If my quirk never came back, I should look for some other way to help people. I nearly fell over as another explosion ripped through the air. I looked across the street and noticed the big plume of smoke from earlier. Had I really wandered to the scene without realizing it? I was heading into the crowd of watchers before I could stop myself. Old habits die hard, and I spent most of my life chasing scenes like this. My mind stopped and my blood ran cold as I saw the cause of the scene. How'd he get here? I asked no one in particular, eyes wide in disbelief as the slime villain wreaked havoc in the street ahead. Even more alarming, it had taken another hostage. I squinted, trying to see who might have been captured, and I could clearly see my own school's uniform. My breathing grew heavy, panic setting in at the idea that someone I knew had been taken hostage by a villain. It's my fault. Distantly, I heard someone say that the hostage had been taken before the first explosion, well over 10 minutes ago. I got in the way of 𝗕𝗵𝗃's work. I started panicking harder at that news. 10 minutes. I could barely last for one. I'm so sorry. Please hang in there. My state of mind just got worse from there as another explosion rocked out. A growing sense of dread swelled in my chest, and a familiar head of ashen blonde hair poked out above the slime villain's mouth. Oh no. No. The heroes weren't doing anything. The villain was just sitting there. That hostage was dying, and dear God, please don't be after what seemed like an eternity. The hostage looked out towards the crowd, pain clear in her familiar red eyes. Katsuki. I ran out before I had a chance to think. I could hear the panic behind me as I charged into the fray. Heroes and civilians alike were calling for me to stop, to come back. And I was vaguely aware of the news helicopter above me. None of that mattered to me right now. The slime saw me coming and tried to swat me away with a tendril of goo, but I managed to stumble out of the way. This was my first time fighting in the real world, where stamina actually existed, but I was determined to see this through. You again, huh? The slime laughed as it recognized me. Sorry, you lost your chance. I have a better cloak now. I bit back a retort as focused on the slime's movements. It caught me by surprise last time, but I was more than ready now. As I dove out of the way of another attack, I saw a hidden gem in the pile of rubble, a piece of rebar. A far cry from the swords that I was accustomed to, but the weight was familiar and I felt a lot better about my chances with this in my hand. I charged the villain again, readying my makeshift weapon as the slime reared back for another attack. I dropped into a slide early, then pushed myself up before the attack could connect. With a swift upward strike, my rebar disconnected the slime's arm cleanly, and I charged yet again. I hurled my rebar at the slime's face, causing it to flinch back and uncover Bakugo's mouth. You damn brat, the slime yelled as it recoiled. The fuck are you doing here, nerd? Bakugo grunted out, gasping for air. I ignored her as I reared back a fist, sizing up a good spot and plunging deep. I had to be fast if this was going to work. Waste no time on extra talking. I rested my free hand on the side of Bakugo's head as the other wriggled around in the slime, and finally found what I was looking for. pulling as hard as I could. My hand came free of the slime, and 𝗵𝗃𝗁's hand came up with it. "Your hand's free," I shouted as loud as I could. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 stared at me in disbelief, and I shot a frenzied look at her. "Blast, now." "But you'll," she started, but I cut her off. "Just do it," I practically screamed at her. She bit her lip, hesitating for just a moment, before letting off as big a blast as she could. It seared into me, but I held onto her wrist for dear life. Thankfully, it did exactly what I hoped, and freed most of 𝗵𝗃𝗁's body from the enveloping slime. Ignoring the burning pain, I barely managed to pull 𝗵𝗃𝗁 free, and we fell backwards in a heap. The slime chose that moment to recover, conveniently. "You little pest," it shouted, raising another large tendril. "I'll crush you for that." It brought the tendril down, and I tried to cover 𝗵𝗃𝗁 protectively, but the attack never landed. Tentatively, I looked back up. "I really am pathetic." All Might stood above us, grinning widely in reassurance as he held off the slime's attack. "Oh, Might." I stared at him in wonder, almost forgetting the situation as I struggled to process the top hero's presence. "Even though I admonished you, I wasn't putting what I said into practice. Pro heroes are always risking their lives." My heart skipped a beat as his fist reared back, and I scrambled to try and cover 𝗵𝗃𝗁 again, despite her protests. "Detroit smash," I cried out as the air pressure skyrocketed, and a short-lived tornado appeared to blow the slime villain away. The wind died down as fast as it started up, but the air pressure formed clouds high above that started pouring rain over the area. He made clouds with a punch. The crowds were chanting and cheering for All Might before I knew it. The man himself appeared winded, barely able to stand. After a moment to compose himself, All Might pumped a single fist up in the air, causing the cheering to erupt into full-on applause. "Oi, nerd. You can get off me now." My face turned crimson as I scrambled off of 𝗵𝗃𝗁, backing away and apologizing profusely. She just sat up slowly and ignored me, a light blush dusting her cheeks. I fell quiet again as I stood up, looking around and noticing All Might approach. "Are you two all right?" he asked, his ever-present smile dropping slightly as he waved the other heroes away. I smiled back in reassurance. 𝗵𝗃𝗁's eyes widened as she realized who was addressing us. She shot to her feet and, for the first time in her life, seemed at a loss for words. "I think we'll be all right," I answered, raking a hand through my hair. "I'm sorry I got in the way of your work." My smile dropped and I stared at the ground as All Might nodded along. "There's a limit to how reckless you can be, young man," All Might confirmed, hands on his hips. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 kept looking between All Might and I, but said nothing as she watched the exchange. "Why did you think that running out like that would be a good idea?" I looked up at my idol with a sad look on my face. He really seemed to be at a loss over my actions. I could come up with many different reasons to explain my actions, but in that moment, she just looked like she needed help, I said quietly, staring down at the concrete. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 narrowed her eyes at me, opened her mouth to speak, but was cut off by All Might. "Many top pros have stories about them from their school days," he started, placing a hand on my shoulder. I looked up at him sharply, my breath hitching in my throat as I saw the look of understanding on his face. "Most of those stories have one thing in common. Their bodies moved before they had a chance to think." I started shaking, and I clutched at my chest, unable to stop the tears from falling. "That was true for you too, wasn't it?" I wiped my eyes, nodding as I tried to contain the sheer catharsis. All Might gripped my shoulder comfortingly, and 𝗵𝗃𝗁 looked away awkwardly. Nothing could prepare me for what he said next, though. "My earlier assessment was wrong, it seems. You can become a hero." And just like that, the floodgates were open, and it was all I could do to keep myself from sobbing outright. Being a hero had always been my dream, even before 𝗬, and it had just been validated by the symbol of peace himself. Of course, that's where 𝗵𝗃𝗁 had to draw a line. "You can't be serious," 𝗵𝗃𝗁 almost spat. "It can't be a hero, his quirk is useless. He saved your life without using it." All Might pointed out amusedly, seeming unsettled by 𝗵𝗃𝗁's response. I wiped my eyes and shot a glare at the girl, who just looked away, annoyed. All Might let out a hearty laugh, then ushered 𝗵𝗃𝗁 and I towards the paramedics who had arrived on scene. "Let's get you kids checked out, and then I'll escort you home, hm." 𝗵𝗃𝗁 stalked ahead wordlessly, and I trailed behind her, sniffling and drying my eyes. I don't think I'll ever really understand what goes on her mind. "You didn't need to do anything, Deku. I could have handled that by myself." I looked over at 𝗵𝗃𝗁, whose gaze was firmly ahead. All Might was following behind, escorting us home as promised. If he heard our conversation, he didn't say anything. "It's not about whether you needed it, 𝗵𝗃𝗁-san," I replied quietly. "Then why the fuck did you do it?" "I'd rather help someone who doesn't need it, as opposed to not helping someone who does need it. 𝗕𝗫. Whatever, Deku. Don't go thinking I owe you for this. And stop looking down on me." I rolled my eyes, but said nothing in response. This was just more of Bakugo's usual attitude, but without any real venom behind it. Putting her out of my mind, I pulled out my phone to see what I had missed. 2 missed calls from Asuna. Private messages. Asuna, you okay? You never miss my calls. Midoku-kun. Did something happen? I just saw the news. Please tell me that's not you. Please answer me. Midoku-kun. I stared down at my phone, a warm feeling blooming in my chest. Even after all this time, it was a bit surprising how good it felt to have friends who worried about you. After a moment of consideration, I started tapping out my response. Izuku, I'm alright. Asuna. Oh, thank God. Explain now. Mr. Why did I see you on the news? Izuku, I've had a kind of interesting day. I got to meet All Might, though. He said that I can be a hero. Asuna, that's pretty cool, but it doesn't explain anything. Izuku, it's complicated. I don't have time to explain right now. Asuna, you'd better call me later tonight then. Izuku, yes ma'am. Slipping my phone back into my pocket, I saw that we'd arrived at Bakugo's house. All Might offered a farewell to the girl, which Win ignored. After Bakugo slipped into the house, no doubt about to be yelled at by her mother, All Might and I set off in the direction of my own home. After making it a few blocks, All Might let his muscle form drop. You have my thanks, young man. I stopped short, looking up at my idol in shock. What for? It was my fault to begin with. Indeed, it's because it was none other than the weak, powerless you at the scene that I was able to act. If you hadn't been there, I would have become a guy in a bodysuit that was nothing but all talk. I just stared at All Might, slack-jawed. He continued on in the face of my confusion. I meant it when I said that you can be a hero, but I feel I must offer you the chance to be more than that. More than a hero. What could he possibly mean by that? Your desire is to help those in need and to honor the fallen. I believe you have what it takes to become the next symbol of peace. The symbol of peace. You can't be serious. I can't. You can. All Might cut me off with a hearty laugh, which sounded odd coming from his emaciated form. You're more than worthy to inherit my power. Inherit? What the hell are you talking about? I cried loudly, scratching my head with both hands. This was all going too fast, and now I was lost. I'm talking about my quirk, young man. All Might said theatrically, arms spread wide. My quirk has always been a hotly debated topic, and it certainly gives me superhuman strength. The truth is, though, that it was passed on to me like a sacred torch. It was passed to you. A quirk like that has never been confirmed, though. That's because the world could never accept that the symbol of peace wasn't born with such power. All Might raised an open hand in front of his chest. One person cultivates this power, then passes it on to another person that also cultivates it. It's the crystallization of power, the culmination of many generations of desires to help those in need. That is the power that I inherited, the power which I now offer to you, one for all. Why? I asked with a wavering voice, tears threatening to fall. Why would you offer something like this to me? I came to this town to find a successor. Today, you proved to me that it would be all right for you to inherit this power, even with your atrophied body. And unable to use your quirk, you were more heroic than anyone else today. I started shaking again, and the tears from before won out and fell freely. All Might rested a hand on my shoulder for what seemed like the 100th time that day. So, how will you answer? All Might smiled down at me encouragingly. This is real. Of all the people who'd believe in me, I never expected my idol, the symbol of peace himself, to encourage me the way he had today. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect an offer like this, to practically be his protege. Of course, I had no reason to turn him down. I took a step back, away from his comforting grip, and took a moment to compose myself. As soon as my eyes and emotions were back under my control, I looked at my new mentor with a look of fierce determination. Of course, I accept. All Might rested a hand over one of his sunken eyes, smiling widely. I was hoping you'd say that. We parted ways after that, having exchanged contact information. Training would begin very soon, and my already busy schedule would be a hell of a lot busier. Receiving All Might's power, one for all, wouldn't be easy, but I was confident I was up to the task. I heaved as hard as I could, feeling the burn of the ropes in my hands as I tried to haul the massive appliance behind me. It didn't take very long for me to give up on the clearly impossible task that All Might had set for me. Oi, giving up already. All Might laughed from his place on top of the fridge that he wanted me to move. You'll never be ready for the entrance exam at this rate. I'll never be ready for anything if this is what you have me starting with, I snarked, pushing myself up to my knees. Why do you think that massive thing is a good start line? Because, your body isn't a very good vessel for one for all. Which is why we were at Dagobah Beach at 5 in the morning. All Might had the idea that moving the junk around here would be great for building up my physical strength, and I agreed. Plenty of heavy furniture and appliances. Yes, but I started with a sigh. Have you considered I might not be strong enough for a giant fridge? It's as big as you are, and you're sitting on it. I pointed all of this out with a sardonic tone. I sighed again as I wandered over to a nearby pile of smaller appliances. You may have a point, young man, All Might conceded, dropping to the ground effortlessly. He took a moment to consider the surrounding area, resting his hand on the top of the fridge. I hadn't considered that you are still recovering from atrophy. Your body was comatose for 2 years, correct? That's right, I confirmed, running my hands along a microwave, trying to push electricity into it. My body and quirk both atrophied from it. It occurs to me that I don't know what your quirk is, All Might commented. I assume it's electrical based. Yeah, I can absorb, manipulate, and discharge electricity. Electrokinesis. I let sparks run up and down my arms to demonstrate. All Might hummed, thinking to himself as I started hauling a couple broken chairs to the curb. We'll have to set aside some time to work on your quirk, then. The hero pulled out a folded-up packet of papers and started looking over them. This is a meal and training plan that I wrote up with your body in mind. Adjusting it for your quirk shouldn't be too difficult. I stopped for a moment as All Might handed me the stack of papers, labeled at the top as Aim to Pass, American Dream Plan. Flipping through them, I paled at the sheer amount of work that would be needed. I'll show this to my mom, I muttered, scratching the back of my head as I ran through some of the meal plans. This is going to be hell. All Might let out a hearty laugh as he slapped my back lightly. This is going to be very tough for you, All Might confirmed, leaning down and looking at the pages over my shoulder. Think you have what it takes? I don't have a choice, I said confidently, looking up at the hero with determined face. I have to work many times harder than everyone around me if I'm going to catch up. All Might just grinned, apparently pleased with that response. And so began my 10 months of hell. Something had gotten into Deku. Ever since he woke up from Sao, it was obvious he wasn't the shy brat that Katsuki remembered. A small traitorous part of her mind was pleased with that, but it still pissed her off to no end. Deku was just supposed to be a pebble in the side of her road, a side character, but these days he looked at her like she was competition. You don't need a quirk to be dangerous, Bakugo-san. Her whole life, Katsuki had believed that quirks were everything. Everyone around her seemed to think so, had always praised her quirk above all else. Deku and his useless sparking should have been the bottom rung. And it pissed Katsuki off that he believed he could be anything with a useless quirk like that. Then he had gone and proved her wrong. Katsuki had never seen anyone move the way Deku did that day with the slime villain. It was clear that he was still weak from his long sleep, but the way Deku had moved spoke of experience that Katsuki hadn't thought possible. Deku had saved her life without his quirk, not that she would ever admit it, and now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Katsuki groaned and rolled over on her bed. In the months since that day, Deku was exhausted all the time. He seemed to be out of it, barely paying attention in class and struggling to keep his grades up. Every now and again, he slipped back into his old muttering habit. By and large, Deku didn't mutter as much as he used to, if at all, and it was quiet enough that Katsuki couldn't tell what he was saying. Not that she was paying attention. Definitely, now that summer had started, Katsuki was left to her own imagination over what the hell had gotten into Deku. She couldn't tell if that was worse or not. Katsuki pushed herself up and threw on her running outfit. Thankfully, her father and the old hag were gone for the day, doing fuck knows what. Katsuki always enjoyed having the house to herself. After stepping out for a run, she'd made it about 100 feet before stopping in her tracks. Deku was crossing the street a ways down from her, and he wasn't alone. Some girl that Katsuki didn't recognize was walking with him. Her chestnut hair had a braid tied back on either side, but Katsuki couldn't make out any other features. She was giggling about some stupid hand motions Deku had made. What the hell? Katsuki turned and ran the other direction. Who the hell was that girl? How did Deku know her? Katsuki had never seen her before, and that meant she didn't go to 𝗎𝗪𝗏. What the hell is Deku doing chatting up a girl from another school? Katsuki stopped and kicked out a trash can, hating the tight feeling in her chest. Why the hell did this piss her off so much? She took a minute to compose herself, resumed her run, and made sure to go far away from wherever Deku and that girl were headed. The questions just kept piling up, and Katsuki was determined to get to the bottom of it. But how? All Might was certainly a slave driver when it came to training. Not that I was complaining. By the time summer came to an end, I was feeling better than I ever had in my life. I had started off with small things like chairs and tires, but as time went on, I moved up to heavier and heavier things. I'd consider that fridge to be my first milestone, though, and I wasn't quite there yet. Today, I was practicing with my quirk. All Might usually didn't show up for long on my quirk days, and today was no exception. He'd shown up as the sun started to set, probably having just finished his daily hero work. I closed my eyes and concentrated on the flow of electricity in my arms. All Might stood by and watched as I pushed the currents out and latched them onto an old stove. I groaned at the effort, and with sweat forming on my brow, I managed to heave the stove up into the air with my quirk. Impressive, All Might commented, approaching as I let the stove drop back to the ground. Control over your quirk is returning at a fine pace. I'm just glad it's not taking as long as the first time around, I said, trying to shake away the aches in my arms. It took years to be able to do that before. It felt great to be working on my quirk again, after all this time. It wasn't anywhere near what it was before 𝗬, but at the rate it was going, it'd be better than before by the time the entrance exams happened. That was the hope, at any rate. Once school started, my progress would slow down again. I'd already had a problem with overworking in the past few weeks. Something All Might had scolded me about. I have to work many times harder than everyone around me. All Might had given me the day off over it, because overwork would be detrimental, but he still took it upon himself to adjust my plan. Part of me dreaded the increase in workload, especially with the coming school term, but I was determined to keep up. That should be enough for today, All Might said, ushering me back to the entrance of the beach and chuckling over the aggravated noise I made. Can't have you overworking yourself again, young man? Yeah, I know, I grumbled, resisting the urge to kick some loose trash. It's just so aggravating, you know. I've worked up this far, but I still have so much to do. There's still 7 months before the entrance exam, All Might pointed out with a chuckle. You'll be ready long before then, I think. I just offered a tired smile and wandered off in the direction of home, pulling my phone out to check for notifications. As I turned the corner, though, I nearly ran face first into 𝗵𝗃𝗁. Watch where you're going, nerd, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 said gruffly before looking me over with a raised eyebrow. The fuck are you so worn out for? Been working out? Yeah, I said, still unused to the idea of 𝗵𝗃𝗁 being civil. And you're out for a run, I see. TCH, yeah, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 grunted, stepping past me to look out over the beach. After a moment of silence, she turned back to me with a look of confusion. Why the fuck are you working out here instead of a gym? It was my trainer's idea. It's a good place to work on both my body and quirk. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 narrowed her eyes and stared at me for a good few seconds. Since when can you afford a personal trainer? Her tone was low, almost threatening. It almost reminded me of 𝗬𝗎. It's not about affording it, or I wouldn't have been able to do this, I stated, scratching the back of my head. He just felt like helping, and I'm not really in a position to turn him down. TCH, whatever Deku. Is that why you've been so fucking out of it at school? Yeah, pretty much, I confirmed, my eye twitching a bit at the old nickname. All the free time I had before is spent working out now. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 took a step back and considered me for a moment, and I could almost see a hint of approval in her eyes. And what about your quirk? I work out 6 days a week, and 2 of them are spent solely on my quirk. I let a few strips of electricity crackle up and down my arms. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 smiled a bit at that, small but feral. I felt a shiver go up my spine when I saw it. That was 𝗵𝗃𝗁's I've been challenged smile. I suddenly had a very bad feeling in my stomach. I texted All Might to warn him about 𝗵𝗃𝗁. I had a feeling that she would show up at the beach. It might be better if we just tell her straight out, I said as I heaved a small dresser into the back of All Might's small truck. All Might himself grunted and appeared lost in thought for a moment. Is that truly wise? All Might asked as he rubbed his temple, frustrated somewhat at the situation. My secret has been carefully kept for the last several years. I'm not sure I see the merit of letting your classmate know. For the most part, neither do I admitted as I leaned against the truck. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 is very smart though. She already suspects something is up, just by me being here. It won't take her long to put the pieces together. I'll think about it, young man, All Might sighed as he got into his truck. For now, just continue hauling furniture up to the loading area. I should return in time for lunch. I waved the hero off as he drove away, and turned back to the beach. I'd cleared a hefty amount in the past 3 months, and by my estimation, I'd be done around a month before the entrance exam. Deku, my eye twitched, and I turned to face 𝗵𝗃𝗁, who had shown up in the minute that I was spacing out. Good morning, 𝗵𝗃𝗁-san, I greeted with a polite smile. What brings you here? You fucking know why, nerd, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 snarled, though without any real bite. I rolled my eyes. Not really, but I guess it has something to do with my training. I turned and headed down into the maze of junk, looking for a decently sized piece to haul. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 followed without a word, watching carefully as I lifted a small cabinet onto my shoulder. Gonna make things awkward if you just stare like that. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 just huffed as I hauled the cabinet up and dropped it in the loading area. Where's your trainer? She asked, looking around. I paused and pulled my phone, shooting a quick text to All Might. Izuku, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 just showed up taking some stuff to an actual dump right now, I responded, keeping my tone carefully bland. He said he'd be back in a couple hours. All Might, is she bothering you? Izuku, not really, it's kind of awkward. Though she's just following me around and watching me work, I don't know if I should tell her to leave. Or what. All Might, young 𝗵𝗃𝗁 is a hero hopeful as well, yes. It may be worthwhile for her to lend assistance. Izuku, you sure? Will I still be a good enough vessel by the end? All Might, that may not be as much an issue for you as I first imagined. If your focus is your natural quirk, one for all will not pose much of a problem, at least early on. Izuku, if you're sure I'll make the offer. I slipped my phone back into my pocket with a quiet sigh, before turning to meet 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗁's quiet glare. You want in? I asked bluntly, putting on a polite smile as 𝗵𝗃𝗁 raised an eyebrow. In on what? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 asked, shoving her hands in her pockets. You're fucking training here. Why the fuck would I want in on this? Because it's a good workout, I answered as I headed back down to the nearest heap of trash. It may not be a normal workout regimen, but hauling stuff like this around has a way of working up strength and stamina. Why not just work out in a gym like a normal person? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 snarked, narrowing her eyes at the trash around us. It's good practice for being a hero. Heroics was originally about community service, after all. The goal here is to have the entire beach cleared by the time April rolls around. 𝗵𝗃𝗁's eyes widened, and she stopped to stare incredulously between me and the mountains of trash and furniture. You're shitting me. All of this, by April? That's the idea. I grinned at the stunned girl, picking up a tire and letting it rest on my shoulder. Think it's too much for you? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 responded by snatching the tire from me and marching back up to the loading area wordlessly. So, who's your girlfriend? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 asked suddenly as she dropped a stack of chairs in the loading area. My what? I wheezed through a sudden coughing fit. Where the hell did that come from? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 just rolled her eyes at me. That chick you've been walking around with, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 said tersely. I've fucking seen you two together a few times since summer started. Oh, her. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 must have seen Asuna and I in town on a few of her runs. Her name is Yuuki Asuna. She's a friend from Sao, and definitely not my girlfriend, no matter how much Yui might want otherwise. I see, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 said, shifting where she stood for a moment, before heading back down to the beach. I watched her as she walked away, debating whether to ask why she wanted to know. Something about the way 𝗵𝗃𝗁 addressed the topic had me a bit unsettled. Before I had a chance to consider, however, the rumble of a car driving up caught my attention. I turned just in time to see an emaciated All Might kill the engine to his truck and step out. Young Midoriya, All Might greeted with a small wave. Is your classmate still here? I hummed a confirmation as All Might took place at my side. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 was hesitant, but with a bit of prodding, she threw herself into it. It wasn't long before 𝗵𝗃𝗁 returned to the loading area, dropping her cargo on the stack we'd built up. I see you've decided to join us, young lady, All Might commented with a smile. Yeah, what of it? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 asked, clearly unimpressed with my mentor's current appearance. I'm glad of it, All Might said, smiling more widely as 𝗵𝗃𝗁 raised an eyebrow. It's always a pleasure to assist the growth of another hero hopeful. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 growled and looked away, clearly not the answer she was expecting. I shook my head and started hefting items into the truck. So who the fuck are you, anyway? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 asked as she joined in on the hauling. My name is Yagi Toshinori. I started as All Might introduced himself. It never occurred to me that I didn't know the hero's real name, so this was the first I'd heard it. I'm a retired pro hero. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 paled as All Might lifted his shirt to reveal his grisly wound. What the fuck is that? 𝗵𝗃𝗁's voice was hoarse. I received this from a villain I fight several years ago. It forced my retirement. I was honestly surprised that All Might would reveal this much right off the bat. This was the cover story that we had come up with in the event that others discovered our arrangement. I'd told my friends and family that I was being trained by a retired pro hero, but hadn't gone into any detail. As you can see, I'm no longer fit for the job of pro hero. However, I still remember my training regimen and meal plans clearly. If you wish to join young Midoriya in this training, I would be happy to assist you. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 looked at me for a long moment. When I raised an eyebrow at her questioningly, she scoffed and looked away, shoving her hands in her pockets. Sure, why the fuck not? Great. All Might cheered quietly, smiling widely at the girl. I'll write up plans for you tonight. For now, I believe lunch is in order. My treat. With a hearty laugh, All Might ushered 𝗵𝗃𝗁 and I into his truck. Now, there is a great cafe which I believe is nearby. Time advanced without much of interest happening. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 regularly attended training at the beach, bringing an air of competition with her every time. Although she maintained her usual better-than-you attitude, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 was generally civil during training. And she left me alone at school when the new term began. It was honestly refreshing, and made me feel like we could go back to being friends like we had been before. On the days I'd focus on my quirk, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 would alternate between hauling and watching me practice, occasionally asking questions or shouting out ideas. She'd been taken aback at just what I could do with my electricity, more than just the useless sparking off that she thought I was limited to. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 and I finished clearing the beach in February, almost 2 months ahead of schedule, and All Might treated us to lunch at an expensive restaurant to celebrate. As the sun was setting, my mentor and I returned to the newly cleared and clean beach for the after party. You kids have done an amazing thing, All Might praised as he looked out over the sands. Only a day had passed and there were already couples and families present. I just smiled and leaned against the railing, watching some kids play in the water below. I feel like I've been blessed, I sighed, smiling softly as I rested my head on one hand. You've done so much for me. I have a real chance of getting into UN now because of you. What are you saying now, after all this time? All Might chuckled quietly, scratching the back of his head. I looked up at him with a sheepish grin. Young man, the things you are given because you're blessed, and the things you are granted because you are recognized are different in essence. With a quick look around to make sure no one was watching, All Might swelled up into his muscle form and plucked a single hair. This is power that you earned through great effort. Remember that. My eyes widened and I couldn't stop from tearing up at the inspiring words. Without missing a beat, All Might presented the hair to me. Eat this. What? My mind blanked out. All Might seriously wanted me to eat one of his hairs. You have to ingest my DNA in order to inherit my quirk. All Might laughed heartily, still holding the hair out to me. I took the hair with a grimace, examining the golden strand carefully before shoving it into my mouth and struggling to swallow. That's disgusting, I grumbled, resisting the urge to cough up the hair. I imagine I have to wait for my stomach to digest the hair before I can use your quirk. Right you are, young man. All Might gave a hearty laugh before dropping back into his emaciated form with a cough. It will be a few hours before any effects take place. When they do, it would be unwise to move, lest you activate one for all by accident. Right, I grimaced at the thought of accidentally blowing up my house. All Might laughed and slapped my back lightly. No need to worry, young Midoriya. There's still 2 months before the entrance exam. I'm sure you'll gain at least a small grasp of one for all before then. Thankfully, I didn't need to worry. Despite feeling kinda strange over the next couple days, I never used one for all by accident. The last 2 months before the entrance exam were spent with All Might, figuring out how to tap into one for all. All Might turned out to not be very helpful for it. When he'd inherited the quirk, All Might was able to use it to its fullest extent right off the bat. The only advice he could think to offer was just feeling it. Brilliant. Luckily, something about it felt very similar to my natural quirk. It didn't take me very long to figure out the difference between the two. Figuring out how to tap into the massive energy that is one for all led to an interesting discovery. It both amplified and powered my electrokinesis. One for all could act as a source of power for my electricity, eliminating the need to draw from outside sources, and it could make the electricity I discharge a lot more powerful. It wasn't all good, though. As a source of power, one for all actually made me lightheaded and nauseous if used too much, and the amplified electricity was strong enough that it even hurt me to use. Both of these things were frustrating, but I had to remember that correcting these problems would be part of my training at UA, and I had to get in before that would be possible. Which is why I'm standing at the entrance to the nation's top hero school in the early morning, looking past the gates to you. And up at the main building made me feel like I was standing at the entrance to a dungeon in Aincrad. I shivered as I pushed the thought out of my mind, and wished that Asuna could be here with me right now. Sadly, she was elsewhere on campus, part of the recommended lineup. It was hard to remember that she came from a well-to-do family sometimes. Out of the way, Deku, growled a gruff voice behind me, and I turned to see 𝗵𝗃𝗁 walk up with her usual scowl. I rolled my eyes and let her pass. Good morning, 𝗵𝗃𝗁-san, I greeted with a polite smile as she walked past, but neither of us made any other attempt at conversation. That was how it had been for the majority of our training together under All Might. As I watched 𝗵𝗃𝗁 walk away, I heard whispers running around some of the other test-goers, identifying 𝗵𝗃𝗁 as the hostage held by the slime villain nearly a year ago. I scoffed and dismissed the rumors as I walked up towards the building. Or I would have, at least, if I didn't trip over my own feet like an idiot. Well, I guess this is it. I braced myself for impact, and was surprised when it didn't come. Tentatively, I looked around, and found myself floating in air. This feels freaky. I flailed around, panic setting in at the sudden loss of mobility. Are you okay? Asked a bubbly voice that cut through my panic. I focused on the voice and found a relatively cute girl with brown hair smiling at me. This new girl reached out and adjusted my orientation, then released her quirk. Sorry for using my quirk on you without permission, but falling over like that would be bad luck. Ah, it's okay. I smiled politely and scratched the back of my head. I don't know about luck, but it would be bad for focus if I fell on my face right off the bat. That aside, though, what kind of quirk was that? Gravity manipulation. I scratched my chin as I mulled over the possibilities. Yeah, the girl laughed nervously, scratching her cheek with one finger. Anything I touch with all 5 fingers loses its gravity. That's so cool, I gushed, causing the girl to flinch back, and I grinned sheepishly. Sorry. I get kind of excited when I learn about new quirks. That's okay, the girl said, seeming put off by my enthusiasm. We should probably head inside before we're late. Good luck. I waved her off and waited a minute before following. Despite the awkward conversation, I had to thank the girl. I wasn't feeling as nervous as before. For those of you tuning in, welcome to my show today. Everybody say hey. The hero paused and waited for the audience to respond, his goofy blonde tower of hair wobbling in the silence. When no response was given, the hero marshaled on. I'll be giving you the rundown of what to expect in the coming practical exam. Are you ready? You could have heard a pen drop in the silence that followed. I was tempted to actually drop my pen just to make good on the saying. Oi, Deku, Bakugo said, catching my attention. Isn't that a pro hero? The voice hero, present Mike, I confirmed, resting my head on one hand. He puts on a radio show every week, talking about various things in the hero world. Bakugo grunted and turned her attention back to the hero's animated presentation. Turn your attention to the sheets in front of you. You should notice that today's practical will be a 10-minute mock urban battle against robots. Present Mike paused as the screen behind him flickered into action. You can bring any support items you like with you, and you'll all be split up into 7 different foe cities at random. The exam will take place in all 7 locations simultaneously. They'll probably split up people from the same towns, I commented as I scanned the page. Bakugo scowled at the idea. So I don't get to crush you, the girl growled lowly, leaning back in her chair. There's always next time, Bakugo-san, I snarked, rolling my eyes and grinning inwardly as Bakugo growled again. Each battle center will be littered with a set number of fake villains that come in 3 varieties. Right on cue, 3 silhouette icons appeared on the screen behind the hero, each labeled with a different number. Each type of villain is assigned a point value based on difficulty. The weakest is worth 1 point, medium is 2 points, and the harder villain will net you 3. I have a question. An examinee with neat hair and glasses seated a few rows ahead of us stood, and a spotlight activated to shine down on him. There are 4 villain types printed on the paper. If this is a misprint, then UA, renowned as the top school of heroics in Japan, should be ashamed of such a mistake. I narrowed my eyes at Guy. He wasn't technically wrong, but it was probably a bit much to call the school out for it before the presentation even ended. This overly serious examinee apparently wasn't finished, as he turned and stared up in the direction of Bakugo and myself. Also, you too, with the curly hair, and the girl at your side. Next to me, Bakugo snarled, and I met the bespectacled boy's stare in silence. You both have been mumbling to each other this entire time. It's distracting. If you think this is some kind of vacation, then leave now. Bakugo shot to her feet with a growl, and I pulled her back down to her seat as quiet laughter rang out around us. Leave it. It's not worth it to start a fight now. By some small miracle, Bakugo let it go with an audible growl, and I shot a sharp glare in the direction of the uptight boy. Now, that's enough of that. Present Mike called out, drawing attention away from Bakugo, and I thanks for the message, little listener. A 4th villain icon appeared on the big screen. The final villain type isn't worth any points. A 0-pointer. It's more of an obstacle, and it goes crazy in tight spaces. It isn't impossible to defeat, but there is no merit in doing so. Thank you very much. The uptight boy shouted and sat down, the spotlight on him fading out. That's it from me, listeners. As the hero, Napoleon Bonaparte, once said, a true hero is someone who overcomes life's misfortunes. There was a beat of silence as the hero let those words sink in. Go beyond, plus ultra. I stepped off the bus in front of Battle Center B, and took a moment to look around. The practical was due to start soon, and I wouldn't have much time to gauge the other examinees. Everyone here would be competing for a limited number of points. For a moment, I was reminded of the first floor of Aincrad, and the limited resources that all the players were forced to compete over. I shook my head roughly. This was no time to be getting caught up in past events. With another glance around, the girl from the entrance caught my eye. She looked nervous, fanning herself with her hands. I took a step in her direction, but was stopped when a hand came down on my shoulder. That girl appears to be trying to focus. The uptight guy from before was here too. Wonderful. What are you even doing here? Are you trying to distract the other examinees? I'm here to take the practical exam, I snapped, narrowing my eyes sharply at the boy. Besides that, the girl seems nervous. If I can help her be calm for the exam, I will. The uptight guy opened his mouth to speak, but was cut off by the ringing voice of Present Mike. All right, start. I looked up at the tower where the hero stood, then at the other examinees around me. They all seemed as confused as I was. As the hero spoke again, I made a split-second decision and dashed past the crowd and into the fake city. What's wrong? There's no countdowns in real life. Better get to it. Behind me, the crowd sprang into action as I went into battle mode. I scanned the intersection around me, picked a direction, and ran off down the street. Just ahead of me, a robot on a single wall burst through a wall to block my path, forcing me to stop short. A 1-pointer, I said to myself as I readied my lightning. Target acquired, the robot intoned, its red eye adjusting before charging at me. I'll kill you. I forced the electricity down my arm and discharged it from my fist as I threw a punch. Different motions had different effects as I discharged my lightning, and this made the attack act as an electrical rocket. I called it the megawatt hammer. A hammer slammed into the shining red eye on the robot's face, and blew it clean off. I grinned to myself as the robot fell to the ground, earning me my first point. Without wasting a moment, I took off past the broken robot in search of more points. I spent the majority of the test keeping away from the other testers, staying near the borders of the fake town where I'd be able to get the most points. About 7 minutes in, the robots on the outskirts started to thin out. By my estimation, I had around 40 points by the time I headed back into the middle of the city. I was debating whether I even needed to get more points when several buildings ahead of me exploded, and a massive silhouette appeared in the ensuing dust cloud. That's the zero-pointer. It's bigger than most of these buildings. The mountain of a robot reared back and slammed a fist down on the road, causing a massive blowback of dust and debris. Other examinees turned and ran from the gigantic thing, cries of fear and panic ringing out around the city. 2 minutes left, and that's my cue to get the hell out of here. I turned and ran without another thought, but I only made it about 20 feet before a soft sound made me stop. My blood ran cold, and I turned to see the girl from the entrance. She was on the ground, her legs trapped under a piece of rubble. With her quirk, she'd be able to free herself easily, but the zero-pointer was advancing too fast for that. She's going to get crushed. I dashed back towards the girl, throwing a few bolts of lightning at the zero-pointer to stop its advance. "Are you all right?" I asked hurriedly as I crouched next to the girl. "I can't reach," she wheezed, straining to reach the debris that had her trapped. I went to move the debris myself, but stopped short as the girl called out to me, "Watch out." The zero-pointer came to a halt, and I looked up to see the massive fist coming down right on top of us. Shit. Without any time to think, I called on 𝗵𝘃𝗶𝗍 to amplify my powers. I thrust both of my hands above me, channeling my electricity into a big circular disc. This was my defensive move, the polarity shield wall. Normally, the radius would be about the same as my height, but amplified like this, it was almost twice that and twice as sturdy. The giant metal fist came down onto the polarity wall, and I screamed against the strain as the concrete beneath me cracked under the pressure. My hands burned from the amplification, and my legs cried out as I struggled to stay standing against the weight. With great effort, I forced my electricity up beyond the polarity wall, and I latched onto the zero-pointer's metal fist. With a great cry, I let the polarity wall drop and heaved the giant fist upwards, away from myself and the trapped girl next to me. Running on instinct and determined to end the threat before it could attack again, I channeled as much of 𝗵𝘃𝗏 as I possibly could. Standing as tall as I could, I raised my hands to the sky and pulled. As my hands came down, a massive bolt of lightning fell from the sky, crackling loudly and striking the zero-pointer in many places. Every spot the lightning struck, an explosion broke out, and it wasn't long before debris was raining down. I nearly fell over from exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me going as the giant robot started falling to pieces. Taking the opportunity to act, I hefted a large piece of debris off of my gobsmacked companion's leg. "Can you stand?" I asked urgently. The girl shifted and tried to push herself up, but quickly fell back down. "My ankle." That was all I needed to hear. I took the girl by her wrists and hefted her up so that she was leaning on my back, piggyback style. "Make us float," I commanded, hobbling away from the growing pile of wreckage. "Oh, right." She took her own gravity first, then rested her hand on my cheek to take mine. "I get nauseous if I use my quirk on myself, so I'm sorry if I throw up on you." "Better than dying," I quipped as I kicked off the ground. The robot behind us was starting to fall over in our direction. Just my luck. In a move I stole from Bakugo, I pointed my palms behind me and discharged a constant wave of electrical energy. Normally I would only be able to glide with this, but with no gravity, I could use my static thrusters to actually fly. The explosions behind us grew closer and closer, and I started panicking internally. "Can't hold on much longer," groaned the girl I was carrying. "Drop your quirk if you have to," I called back to her, and she wasted no time pressing her fingertips together. All at once, I felt gravity return. I put as much into the static thrusters as I could as the ground rushed up to meet us. That's when the zero-pointer finished its explosive self-destruction. The good thing was that we were no longer going to be crushed by exploding metal. The bad news here is that the final explosion gave us a great deal of forward momentum, and if I tried slowing us horizontally, we'd drop like a rock. Shit. I loosened the girl's grip and twisted myself around so that she was hanging from my front. Now moving backwards, I wrapped my arms around her sides and held her tight as we dropped to the ground. With the way I reoriented us, we hit the ground rolling. I grunted in pain as the concrete dug in, and we finally skidded to a stop just before the city's gateway exit. "Time's up. The exam is now over." I heaved a great sigh of relief and exhaustion, spreading my arms out wide. I'd landed on my back, with the girl lying on my chest. I took a moment to look around and noticed the uptight guy approach and kneel by our side. "Are you two all right?" he asked gently, studying me intently. The girl groaned and sat up, looking around blearily. "We're not dead?" she asked confusedly, seeming rather out of it. "She probably passed out for the second half of our flight." I guess not, I confirmed for her, sitting up myself and grinning brightly when our eyes met. She blushed lightly, but smiled back anyway. I think we'll be all right. You should probably get your ankle looked at by recovery, though. The uptight guy offered me a hand, which I took, and he lifted me up to my feet. I can handle that, young man. I turned to see a small, elderly woman approaching from the gate. She walked up to us first, offering a handful of gummy bears to myself and the uptight guy. Where are you hurt, young lady? Just my ankle, the girl answered, rubbing the offending ankle lightly. Without saying anything else, the elderly woman made a kissy face, and her lips extended from her face to give the injured girl a kiss. That's kind of freaky looking. Seeing it gave me a realization, though. You must be the youthful heroine, recovery girl, I exclaimed, slapping one fist into an open hand. The elderly woman just smiled and wandered off in the direction of other examinees. My ankle doesn't hurt anymore. My bubbly companion cheered to herself, standing up and testing her foot. As I smiled at the girl again, the uptight guy turned and addressed me. I am 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵, he offered, adjusting his glasses. It seems I misjudged you before. I apologize. I kept quiet for a moment, studying him before offering a polite smile. Apology accepted, Ida-san. My name is Midoriya Izuku, and I'm 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁 the girl, grinning brightly at the both of us. It's a pleasure to meet you. The three of us conversed as we headed out to the waiting area, where we were taken back to the main building to change and leave for the day. I ended up exchanging numbers with 𝗧𝗧𝗏 and Ida before we parted ways. In spite of the near catastrophe, I felt good about the day's exams. I was confident that I'd make it into 𝗬𝗧 with the way I scored, but I had no way of knowing until that letter came in the mail. It didn't help that All Might had gone to ground and wasn't answering my texts. Waiting had never been good for my anxiety. 4 days. It had been 4 long, excruciating days since the entrance exam took place. I knew from self-scoring that I had barely passed the written exam, and that was to be expected. Catching up on my lost years of work had been hell. I was more confident in my score for the practical portion, in spite of my decent scoring. There were almost 1,000 examinees, and only 100 seats to fill in all the first-year courses at UA. Waiting for the results to come in the mail was excruciating. A sharp poke to my forehead brought me out of my thoughts. You're spacing out again, Asuna said with a concerned frown. Are you all right, Midoku-kun? I'm all right, Asuna, I offered with a tired smile, resting my head on one hand. I'm just anxious for the results. 𝗬𝗧 would be stupid not to take you after what you did in the practical, chirped 𝗧𝗧𝗏 as she sipped on some tea. I'd invited her to hang out at the Dicey Cafe with Asuna and I, and was glad to see the two of them get along. I'd extended the same offer to Ida as well, but he'd been too busy today. Oh really? Asuna asked with an amused glint in her eyes. She smiled slyly at me, and I almost flinched. I know that look. Why don't you tell me about it, 𝗧𝗧𝗏-chan? He was quite vague with the details. I'd love to know more. He was amazing, 𝗧𝗧𝗏 exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. She waved her arms around excitedly as she retold the story, and Asuna listened with rapt attention. I tried as hard as I could to shrink down in my seat, and wondered idly if I could slip out the door before they noticed. It was so cool. I've never seen anyone move like that before. 𝗧𝗧𝗏's excitement dropped into something more soft. He risked his life to save me. Yeah, that sounds like him, Asuna chuckled, adopting a wistful look as she idly stirred her drink with her straw. Midoku-kun has always been like that, always trying to help people, even at risk to himself. So you guys have known each other for a while? 𝗧𝗧𝗏 inquired, looking between me and Asuna with a curious expression. What kind of trouble do you keep finding if you have to risk yourself for it? She giggled to herself, probably thinking that Asuna was exaggerating. Asuna and I shared a look. We'd been prepared for this topic to come up in conversation. Midoku-kun and I are 𝗬𝗧 survivors, Asuna explained, fidgeting uncomfortably in her seat. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 looked up at her, looking both surprised and mildly horrified. I stared out the window, watching a few people pass by outside. We became friends fairly early on in the death game. It's probably generous to say we were friends early on, Asuna, I chuckled mirthlessly, running a hand through my hair as I turned my attention back to 𝗧𝗧𝗏. We met around the end of the first month, but we weren't really friends until later. I'm sorry, 𝗧𝗧𝗏 said quietly, casting her eyes downward and deflating in her seat. It must have been hard for you guys. I didn't mean to remind you of it. Don't worry about it, 𝗧𝗧𝗏-chan. Asuna gripped the girl's shoulder comfortingly and offering a warm smile. You're right that it was hard, but we've got lots of good memories of our time in Aincrad. She's right, you know. I gave 𝗧𝗧𝗏 my most comforting smile. If so didn't happen, I would never have met Asuna or any of our other friends. That seemed to placate the normally bubbly girl. She still looked vaguely guilty, with her cheeks puffed out slightly, and she reminded me somewhat of a sad puppy. I guess you're right, 𝗧𝗧𝗏 conceded after a beat of silence, before turning her attention to Asuna. So what's the story with the nickname? Why call him Midoku? Midoku is the online name he used in 𝗬𝗏, Asuna explained, giving me a wry look. He used parts of his real name for it, so it's not very original. I rolled my eyes at her, says the girl who used her actual name as her username. I snarked in a dry tone, prompting a withering look from the girl in question. 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏 giggled at our antics, taking another sip of her tea. Did you also apply for UA? Asuna-chan, 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏 asked, setting her drink down again. I don't think I saw you at the exams. Asuna went through the recommended program, so she wasn't even at the auditorium with the rest of us. Her practical stuff was different from ours, and she's practically guaranteed a spot in heroics so long as her score is good. Midoku-kun, Asuna looked positively scandalized at my blunt explanation, and 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏 looked thoroughly impressed. You must really be something special then, 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏 praised, and Asuna ducked her head, blushing and looking like she wished she could evaporate. I grinned evilly at her, enjoying this bit of petty revenge. Deciding that Asuna had had enough torment, I switched gears. If we're lucky, we'll all get into the same class. We should find out in the next couple days. Midoku-kun, Asuna admonished, sharing an amused look with 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏. With a groan, I let my head fall onto the table, prompting giggles from the girls across from me. Just how much longer do I need to wait for my results? Izuku, I grunted in acknowledgement, but didn't look up from the fish I held in my chopsticks. Are you all right, Izuku? You're just staring at the fish. Oh, yeah, I'm all right, Mom. I set the fish down and dug into my rice, trying to ignore the concerned stare. Are you sure? Mom asked, setting her chopsticks down and furrowing her eyebrows. You've been pretty out of it these past few days. I know, I sighed, setting down my rice bowl. I'm just so anxious. What if I don't make it in? I know I did well, but UAS standards are so high. Even if you don't make it in, I think it was amazing for you to even try, Mom declared, putting on an encouraging face. I smiled back tiredly and went back to my food. The rest of dinner passed by in silence. I sat myself on the couch, spacing out and lifting a weight as the time dragged on. I barely registered the sound of dishes being done in the kitchen, or when Mom left for the weekly neighborhood watch meeting. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I set aside the weight to investigate. Asuna, any word yet? Izuku, none. It's been a week now, Asuna. It shouldn't be much longer now, Midoku-kun. I got mine today. 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏 sent a text saying she got hers too, Izuku. Lucky you. Did you both get in? Asuna, I did. I don't know about 𝗕𝗏𝗧𝗏, though she hasn't said anything, so she's probably watching it. Izuku, watching what? Asuna, the acceptance letter was a holographic projection. Mine had All Might talking about my performance. I didn't know he was working at UA. How exciting. All Might was working at UA. That was news to me. It would explain his radio silence this past week. Izuku, well, that's interesting. I knew he was in the area, but I didn't know he was going to be a teacher. The apartment's front door slammed open with a crash. I was on my feet in an instant and shot into the hallway to see what the commotion was, only to find Mom scrambling to get her indoor slippers on. Mom, I called out tentatively, worry building up in the back of my mind. Did something happen? Oh, Izuku. Finally winning the battle with her slippers, Mom shot to her feet and spun around to present me with a pristine envelope that was sealed with red wax. It's here. I just stared at the envelope in her hands. After a long week of waiting, the results were finally in. Now that it's here, I can't help but be scared. Gingerly, I took the envelope from my mother and slipped into my room, closing the door gently behind me. Izuku, PNG Asuna. Well, that's convenient timing, Izuku. I'm scared. Mom is pacing outside my door and it isn't helping. Asuna, this isn't any worse than anything we went through already, right? You can do this, Midoku-kun with a groan. I set my phone aside and stared down at the envelope on my desk. What if I don't get in? My heart hammered in my chest, and with shaky hands, I picked at the wax seal. Inside the envelope, I found a sheet of paper that I set aside without reading and a little circular projector. Sucking in a shaky breath, I switched the projector on. I am here as a projection. As the hologram sprung to life, I was treated to an up-close view of All Might's face as he shouted his catchphrase. Good thing Asuna warned me about that. All Might backed away from the screen and was shown to be wearing a yellow business suit and was backed by theatrical lighting on all sides. I'm sorry for the radio silence. I was very busy with paperwork. In fact, I came to this town to be a teacher at UA. All Might chuckled to himself for a moment before a hand appeared on the side of the screen to gesture at the hero. What do you mean, finish up? I have to talk to him about something. I chuckled to myself as a small back and forth went on between my mentor and whoever the hand belonged to, before All Might finally gave up and moved on. On the written exam, you barely passed. It was a very close call, indeed, but you still pulled ahead. Your practical score was more impressive, with a generous 41 points. With these scores, you did very well, but did not quite make the cut for UAS critical standards. My heart stopped in my chest and my blood ran cold. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding as my hands started to shake. I didn't make it in. I had dreaded this outcome. even if I might have seen it coming. It's still so frustrating. Or you wouldn't if it were quite that simple. I paused at that, looking back up at the hologram in confusion. I'd like to think I'm an entertainer, you know. Take a look at this video. With a theatrical flair, All Might presented a TV remote and turned on a screen off to one side. My eyes widened as the screen flickered to life, and I saw a familiar face. 𝗧𝗧𝗏-san. This girl came to speak with the faculty directly after the practical exam, All Might explained, pausing the video dramatically. To talk about what, though? Keep watching to find out. I rolled my eyes at the theatrics as All Might unpaused the video on the screen. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 was seen timidly walking up to present mic. At the exam, there was a kind of plain-looking boy. He had curly hair and freckles. He said his name is Midoriya Izuku. Do you know who I'm talking about? She's talking about me. Can you give him some of my points? I don't know how many he got, but he spent the second half of the exam just saving me. Her eyes screwed shut and she bowed down. At least the points that he lost because of me. Please. All Might paused the video again, and I couldn't stop myself from standing up in utter shock. 𝗧𝗧𝗏-san wanted to give me her points. Your deeds have inspired others to action, All Might said, his gaze pointed at the TV screen behind him. I'd need to text 𝗧𝗧𝗏 to thank her for trying to negotiate on my behalf. The practical exam had another side to it, unrelated to the villain points that you knew about. What? It wouldn't be much of a hero course if we only graded based on fake villain fights. Heroes are not winners, but saviors. No hero course should reject a person who saves others. What kind of lip service would that be? Give me a break. Heroics is all about risking your life to make that lip service into reality. My breath hitched in my throat, and I could barely believe where this was going. The other half of the practical exam, awarded by a panel of judges. There's also rescue points. My eyes widened, and I took a step back. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't stop the hope from building up. Midoriya Izuku, 70 rescue points. With a combined total of 111 points, you have the top score in the practical exam overall. Of course, that means you passed, alongside 𝗧𝗧𝗏, who placed 4th overall. Come now, young Midoriya. This is your Hero Academia. Sometimes, dreams can become reality. Izuku, Asuna I got in. Asuna, see. I knew you would. Has 𝗧𝗧𝗏-chan texted you? I haven't heard from her yet, Izuku. I haven't heard from her either. I hope she's alright. I set my phone aside and went to give Mom the good news. I had 3 weeks to get ready for the new school year to start. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 started responding again after some prodding, having apparently been in an emotional phone call with her parents. The day after I got my acceptance letter, I met All Might out at Dagobah Beach once again, and we discussed my performance in the practical exam. He expressed a certain perplexity at the use of my quirk, specifically the lightning that I pulled out of the sky on a clear day. I informed him that One for All had been active when I'd done it. The only thing I could think of was that One for All had allowed me to extend my control range, and thus let me pull down atmospheric electricity. It was something to consider working on, at least, since I felt very lightheaded after such a move. In the weeks that followed, I celebrated my acceptance in private with Mom and All Might separately, each of them treating me to different meals. I also attended a small party at the 𝗕𝗏𝗏 Cafe, hanging out with all my 𝗬 friends plus 𝗧𝗧𝗏, and discovered that 𝗧𝗏 had been accepted into the support course at UA. I hadn't even known that she was planning to apply for UA. Eventually, though, it was time to get on campus for the first day of high school. I'd arrived a tad early to get a basic idea for the layout. 1A, 1A, I muttered to myself repeatedly, wandering up the hall at a brisk pace. This place is way too big. Finally, I rolled up on the door for my classroom. Stopping to admire the size of the door, I briefly pondered what kind of people I'd find. Images of Bakugo and Ida flickered through my mind, and despite becoming friendly with the latter, and at least somewhat civil with the former, I wasn't sure I'd enjoy sharing a classroom with either. With a shake of my head, I pulled the door open and took in the scene of Ida scolding Bakugo over putting her feet up on her desk. Don't you think it's rude to the upperclassmen to show such disrespect? Ida scolded, his arms flailing in odd robotic patterns. Bakugo just scoffed, not moving in the slightest. Of course not, Bakugo snarled, scowling up at Ida. Why do you have to be so uptight, you fucking side character? Just my luck. I shook my head and ignored them, opting instead to survey the rest of the class. At first I didn't see anything special, but when my eyes landed on a girl near the front, my eyes widened and my blood went cold. 𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏. It took all of my concentration to keep from breathing heavy, and the girl shot me a questioning look. All at once, I realized how different this girl actually looked from 𝗧𝗏𝗏. Only her hair was vaguely similar, and even that was a stretch. This girl had what looked like phone jacks on hanging from her earlobes, and her eyes were more flat. I shook my head again, offered the confused girl a shaky smile, and took another look around. Bakugo was staring at me, one eyebrow raised, and Ida was approaching me with an odd power-walking form. "Good morning, Midoriya-kun," Ida greeted robotically, before pausing in thought. "I've been thinking, these past few weeks, you realized that there was more to the exam than was let on, didn't you? The way you rushed in to save your Araka-san." No," I said in a questioning tone, scratching the back of my head. "I just did what I thought was right. No way I was gonna let her die." "Of course, that's correct," Ida sighed, turning to one side with hand on chin, classic thinking man pose. "Of course, if it hadn't been an exam, I would have done exactly the same thing. As much as I hate to admit it, you're better than me." Did he really just say that out loud? "Wait, hold on," I started in a low tone, narrowing my eyes at the bespectacled boy. "Back up a sec. What did you just say?" That you're better than me?" Ida asked, looking thrown for a loop. "No, before that," I bit out harshly, anger bubbling up in my gut. Ida just looked even more confused, but complied anyway. "If it hadn't been an exam," he started, but I cut him off, not caring that I was drawing the attention of the rest of the class. "You would have done the exact same thing," I finished for him, letting the fury etch itself on my face. "That's her reason. You left her to die for the sake of your exam scores." "I didn't mean to. That doesn't matter," I shouted, causing Ida to flinch back. "In real life, it doesn't matter what you meant to do. What matters is what you did. You prioritized your scores over the life of another person." I sighed, running a hand through my hair as Ida looked away in shame. "Do you remember what you said to me in the auditorium? I'll go ahead and give those words back to you now. If you think this is some kind of vacation, then you should leave now." Silence permeated the room as I stalked past Ida and dropped into the empty seat behind Bakugo, ignoring the eyebrow she raised at me. "Deku," Bakugo said quietly, shifting in her seat to face me. My eyebrow twitched at the nickname. "What, Bakugo?" I regretted the words as soon as they left my mouth, but the girl in question didn't seem fazed by it. "In the exam, you went for the big one." A statement rather than a question. I raised an eyebrow at Bakugo, prompting a roll of her eyes. "I saw that fucking lightning storm from clear across campus. That was you." "Yeah," I sighed, not meeting the Bakugo's gaze. She just grunted and turned back around in her seat. With a cursory glance around the room, I could see some of my new classmates stealing looks at me with varying degrees of concern or interest. I looked back towards the door and was met with the gaze of a very concerned-looking Uraraka. Behind the normally bubbly girl stood a ragged, very tired-looking man dressed in black clothes and numerous odd scarves. I met the tired man's gaze briefly, and caught a flicker of both concern and approval before he made his presence known to the class. "Good morning, kids," the man greeted, sounding every bit as tired as he looked. "My name is 𝗧𝗏, and I'm your homeroom teacher." Aizawa ignored the titters of gossip as he reached into what looked like a sleeping bag, and pulled out what appeared to be a shirt. "Time is limited. All of you, head to the locker rooms and find gym clothes in your sizes. Anyone that isn't at the field in 15 minutes will be expelled." As most of the class cried out in shock, Aizawa paused in the doorway. "Clock's ticking, kids." I got up and stalked out the door without a word to anyone, leaving my stuff at the desk. As the rest of the class bustled out the door behind me, a tap on my shoulder drew my attention to the 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 from earlier. "Yo," she greeted, eyeing me up as she matched my pace. "Hey," I returned the greeting, keeping my eyes firmly ahead. "Sorry for the weird look earlier. I thought you were someone else." "Yeah," I was just about to say. "You looked like you saw a ghost," she joked, twirling one of her jacks around a finger. I grimaced as an image of 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏 appeared in my mind. I thought I did see a ghost. That prompted a surprised look from the girl. I just shook my head and offered her a hand. "Midoriya Izuku, nice to meet you." "𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗏, nice to meet you too," she said, taking my hand after a beat of silence. I offered a small, polite smile, then picked up the pace towards the changing rooms. Time is limited, after all. Quirk assessment test. The class made it out to the field with seconds to spare, prompting another short and tired lecture about time being limited by Aizawa-sensei. Apparently the tired teacher's first order of business was to do a Quirk assessment test, but we're gonna miss the opening ceremony. Uraraka cried, both of her fists pressed against her chest. Small titters of agreement ran around the crowd of students as Aizawa-sensei waved the statement down. "You don't have time for such leisurely things if you're planning to be a hero," droned Aizawa-sensei. "Yua is very non-restrictive with its traditions. Teachers are free to be as loose or firm with those traditions as they like." The tired teacher held up his phone to show a list of basic physical activities. "You've been doing physical tests since middle school. Now, you're going to do them with your quirks. Midoriya, what was your record for the ball throw?" I blinked at the sudden question, struggling to remember off the top of my head. About 50 meters, I said, scratching the back of my head. Aizawa-sensei tossed the ball at me. "Try doing it with your quirk. You can do it however you like, just stay in the circle." As I stepped into the circle that sensei had pointed out, I turned the ball over in my hands, feeling for bits of metal. I could feel little strips of metal running throughout the ball, and I grinned to myself. Hurry it up and give it all you've got. I ran some electrical currents through the ball, then let it drop and hang like a yo-yo with electrical string. 3 cheers for static electricity. I reared back and punched the air, discharging a megawatt hammer and the ball along with it. The ball flailed around behind the electrical rocket like a can tied to the back of a car. I called on one for all to extend my reach, and tried to hold the hammer together after it passed the usual dispersion range. Satisfied with the range that I achieved, I let my quirks drop, and the ball fell to the ground, earning me a score of 638.5. I almost whistled at the score, and the rest of the class cried out in surprise when Sensei showed the score to them. Know your own upper limits first. That's the most rational way to form the foundations of a hero. Over 600 meters, exclaimed a blonde boy with a single streak of black in his hair. That's gonna be tough to beat. Oh, this is gonna be so fun, cried out a girl with pink skin and hair. Fun, you say? Aizawa-sensei said quietly, narrowing his eyes at the offending students. You'll have 3 years to become heroes. Do you really think it will be all fun and games in that time? The tired man's face dropped into a devilish grin. Let's play a game right now, then. Whoever places last in all 8 tests will be expelled immediately. Welcome to the hero course, kids. Angry and surprised cries rang out across the group, many taking offense to the idea that one of us would be expelled. But it's the first day of school, 𝗧𝗧𝗏 cried out, raising her fists again. We don't have any training yet. That's so unfair. Unfair, Aizawa-sensei quoted, narrowing his eyes at 𝗧𝗏𝗏. Do you think natural disasters will be fair? That shut the girl up, and she flinched back as if struck. What about major accidents? Or selfish villains? Every day, unpredictable calamities take place everywhere. The world is filled to the brim with unfairness. It will be your job as heroes to overcome that unfairness. So give it everything you've got. Go beyond, plus ultra. Looking around, I could see my classmates getting fired up. Bakugo was grinning to herself fairly, and even 𝗧𝗏𝗏 looked ready to kick some ass. I took a deep breath and steeled myself for what was to come. Every moment I spend here feels more and more like Aincrad. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 was ashamed. He had felt shame before, mostly when he didn't do so well with his grades. That was the kind of shame that left him agitated, with an itch in the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. This time, it was different. This was the kind of shame that left him feeling hollow inside. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 wasn't used to this kind of shame, had never made a mistake of this magnitude before. He didn't know how to process it. As the assessment continued on, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 found that he couldn't properly concentrate. His results in the running tests were the best of the class, and his long jump score was up there as well. Despite his good performance, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 found himself watching one Midoriya Izuku more closely than ever. He couldn't say for sure why. The more 𝗕𝗏𝗁 watched him, the more he realized that he didn't understand Midoriya at all. Midoriya moved with a kind of gait, a surety that made it seem as though he'd been through hell and found it wanting. It felt like being close to a weapon. What are you even doing here? 𝗕𝗏𝗁 recalled questioning Midoriya on his presence at the exam. At the time, he'd been sure the green bean was just trying to be a distraction. After seeing the boy fight, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 began to suspect. And Midoriya's cutting outburst was all the proof that he needed. Midoriya was already a hero, and his presence at UA was just a formality. More than that, Midoriya was right. There had been a person in need. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 had known, but still he had turned away. In an exam for heroics, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 hadn't acted as a hero at all. How would Tensei respond if he knew? 𝗕𝗏𝗁 watched as 𝗧𝗏𝗏 scored infinity on the ball throw, and a cold feeling appeared in his stomach. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 had come very close to not being able to stand there at all. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 had appeared in the door just before Midoriya's outburst, and her expression since then had been unreadable. If she was angry with him, or with 𝗕𝗏𝗁, she said nothing about it. Granted, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 had been keeping a distance to Midoriya and 𝗧𝗏𝗏 all morning, and the green bean seemed content to do the same. The tests finished up before long, and a sense of dread hung in the air over the students of Class 1A. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 ignored the hushed whispers, fidgeting lightly as Aizawa-sensei pulled up a hologram with the leaderboard. If not for his current mood, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 would have been proud that he got 4th place. Surprisingly, he placed higher than Midoriya's 8th place. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 would have expected the green bean to get 1st or 2nd place, not 8th. Looking over the rest of the board, he was surprised to note that there were only 19 students in the class. Next to him, a floating set of clothes was trembling and moaning pitifully. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 could only guess that this was 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝗏, the student who had placed last on the board. 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝗏-san, 𝗕𝗏𝗁 asked, and received a small grunt in confirmation. He placed a comforting hand on the invisible girl's shoulder. I'm sure it will be all right. You tried your hardest out there. That's right. 𝗕𝗏𝗁 and 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝗏 both jumped at the voice of their teacher, who was now addressing the class. So, I was lying about expelling someone earlier. Think of it as a logical ruse, so that you would try your hardest and not get last place. Most of the 1A students let out cries or gasps of relief, especially one 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝗏, who sank to her knees beside 𝗕𝗏𝗁. Of course it was a lie, said a girl with black hair and a ponytail. It's obvious that no one would be expelled. Right, I thought so, at least. Several students looked at the girl as though she'd grown a second head, making her flush and look away out of embarrassment. Any other time, 𝗕𝗫𝗁 might have agreed with the girl. Now, though, I don't know. That doesn't seem right to me, mused Midoriya, rubbing his chin and looking deep in thought. What if calling it a lie is itself a lie? Maybe no one got expelled because everyone proved their worth. And there it is. Given UAS standards, 𝗕𝗫𝗁 wouldn't be surprised if Midoriya hit the nail on the head with that. 𝗕𝗫𝗁 found himself agreeing with the logic, as did the rest of the class, if the general consensus was any indication. A quick look at Aizawa-sensei, the corners of his lips turned up just barely, told 𝗕𝗫𝗁 all he needed to know. He really would have expelled someone. Now that's out of the way, we're done here. Get changed and go back to the classroom. You'll find curriculum papers and such, so give them a good look over before tomorrow. With that, Aizawa-sensei turned and walked away. 𝗕𝗫𝗁 stared at the tired man's back, lost in his mind. 𝗕𝗫𝗁 turned his gaze to Midoriya, and then to 𝗬𝗧𝗏. If he was going to be a hero, then he was going to have to put himself back on the right track. To do that, he would need to patch up the rift between himself and his two new friends. But how? Even though they're right there, they seem so far away. What a long day. The end of the school day had finally come, and not a moment too soon. I was exhausted, and not just physically. My encounter with 𝗧𝗪 that morning was still weighing on my mind. I went overboard this morning, I said, scratching the back of my head. So, apologize, 𝗬𝗪 retorted, twirling a jack around her finger. I won't say you were wrong, but you were kinda harsh, dude. Yeah, I know, I grumbled as we stepped out of the building. Ahead of us, I could see 𝗧𝗪 and 𝗬𝗧𝗏 standing by the gates. I couldn't make out 𝗬𝗧𝗏's expression, but 𝗧𝗪 was very solemn. No time like the present, I guess, Midoriya-kun, 𝗧𝗪 said, but stopped when I raised a hand to cut him off. I'm sorry, 𝗧𝗪-kun. The bespectacled boy grunted in surprise, caught off guard by my sudden apology. What for? It was my mistake. 𝗧𝗪 seemed at a loss. Yes, but that doesn't excuse how I handled it. I ran my hand through my hair, looking off to the side for a moment. I stand by what I said. It was a lesson that I learned the hard way, after all. But I also need to remember that not everyone has been through the same things as me. You mean so? 𝗬𝗧𝗏 said quietly, prompting surprised looks from 𝗧𝗪 and J.ro. Yeah, I confirmed just as quietly. It's hard, sometimes, to remember that other people my age didn't have to learn that lesson. Because of that, it's easy to get lost in the reaction. So, I'm sorry. And I as well, 𝗧𝗪 said softly. I'm sorry, Midoriya-kun. I'm not the one you should be apologizing to, I said, and glanced over at 𝗬𝗧𝗏. Your mistake didn't affect me, even if I reacted badly to it. 𝗧𝗪 closed his eyes with a grimace, then turned to face 𝗬𝗧𝗏. I'm sorry, 𝗬𝗧𝗏-kun. I made a grave error in judgment, and your life was put at risk. If Midoriya-kun hadn't been there. 𝗧𝗪 trailed off with another grimace. It's okay, 𝗧𝗪-kun. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 comforted him gently, resting a hand on his arm. It all turned out okay in the end. Besides, I don't think I was really in danger. It was just a test, right? 𝗬𝗪 would have been able to do something anyway. Even still, 𝗧𝗪 pressed, adopting a regretful expression. I should have done better. I hope you both will forgive my shameful actions. I smiled at the boy and offered my hand. Friends? 𝗧𝗪 stared down at my hand, then gave a smile of his own as he took it. Friends, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 cheered, resting one hand on ours and pumping the other in the air. The three of us looked over at 𝗔𝗪 expectantly, despite the fact that she had no part in the day's drama. That means you too, you know, I deadpanned. With a snort and a roll of her eyes, J.ro put one hand forward. Sure, why not? Friends. Despite not seeming convinced, 𝗔𝗪's hand landed on top of the pile, and I grinned. She'd come around. After a beat of silence, the four of us separated and set off in the direction of the train station, chatting about various mundane things. I was glad to have the weight off my chest, and I'm certain the others were too. Despite that, though, I was certain our troubles were just beginning. In fact, I was counting on it. I'd expect nothing less from My Hero Academia, 𝗬𝗏 High School, the top school of heroics in Japan and one of the top schools in the world overall. In spite of the trial it was to even get in, the first day of actual class felt remarkably normal. The morning classes were normal, at any rate. For example, Present Mike or Yamada Hisashi taught English classes. The voice hero seemed low-key at first, but wound up into his usual upbeat self as the period dragged on. Having pro-heroes for teachers was an interesting experience, to say the least. It seemed that UA was staffed entirely by pros. Even the cafeteria was directed by the cook hero, Lunch Rush. This rice is really good, I commented. On my left, 𝗔𝗪 grunted in agreement. It makes a great comfort food, chirped 𝗬𝗧𝗏 from across the table. 𝗧𝗪 made no sound, but appeared to be enjoying the rice regardless. Any seats left at this table? I looked up to see Asuna approach, smiling brightly at 𝗬𝗧𝗏, and I waved at the girl, directing her to the plethora of empty seats with a deadpan look. Oh, Asuna-chan. 𝗧𝗧𝗏 greeted enthusiastically. "How's 1B treating you?" I inquired as Asuna sat down next to Ida. "It's all right, I suppose," Asuna said reservedly. "I was expecting a bit more, I don't know, excitement. This is the National School of Heroics, after all." I snorted into my rice unceremoniously, prompting a raised eyebrow from the chestnut-haired girl. "Our homeroom teacher threatened to expel people yesterday," I explained, setting my chopsticks aside. "He said he was lying about it, but I feel like he would have if he felt the need to." "You can't be serious," Asuna protested, quailing under the looks of confirmation that my classmates gave her. "There's no way he would have." "I do believe he would," Asuna-chan said, a new voice out of nowhere, and I turned to see the black-haired ponytail girl from yesterday take a seat next to Jiryu. "But how can you know that for sure, Momo-chan?" Asuna argued, picking at her food as more and more people showed up to fill the table out. "I didn't believe it at first," the girl admitted, her eyes downcast, "which is why I did some digging. Apparently, Aizawa-sensei is an underground hero called Eraserhead, and he expelled his entire class last year because of a lack of potential." "Well, shit. Sounds like we all dodged a hefty bullet there," I joked, a small bead of sweat dripping down my forehead. I was suddenly not looking forward to homeroom going forward, if Aizawa-sensei was as much a hard ass as he appeared to be. Still, we might not have any time to relax. I trailed off, scratching the back of my head. Asuna looked like she wanted to say something, but decided against it when she saw the nods of agreement from my classmate. "Whatever, this is UA. It's not like we were going to have any time to relax anyway, Deku." My eye twitched at the nickname. I peered down the table and glared at Bakugo, ready to retort, but Asuna spoke up before I could. "Deku, huh?" Asuna asked icily. Her eyes narrowed dangerously at the ashen blonde. The blonde in question stared back at her, unfazed. "You must be Bakugo Katsuki." A statement rather than a question, one that prompted a raised eyebrow from Bakugo herself. "You've heard of me?" Bakugo grunted through a mouthful of rice, surprise clear on her face. Or at least, what amounted to surprise for a girl like Bakugo. "Oh, yes, I've heard plenty about you, Kaken," Asuna said acidly, leaning on her elbows to level her most dangerous glare at Bakugo, who glared right back at the mention of her old nickname. "And there's the sub-commander of the 𝗕𝗏," I said with a groan, hiding my face in my hands. Asuna continued on as if I hadn't said anything. "I wonder if you know," Asuna said, her tone bland and her glare hard, "about the kind of damage you've done with your treatment of him." Bakugo's glare softened a bit at that. "I'm not going to mince words here, Bakugo-san. You treated him like dirt." "Asuna," I called, my tone low in warning. Her eyes met mine, and I shook my head slightly. Bakugo, uncharacteristically, made no effort to contest Asuna's statements, opting instead to stare at her food with a sour expression. Asuna looked between Bakugo and I, then sighed and went back to her own food sullenly. "You seem to have a lot of nicknames, Midoriya-kun," 𝗧𝗧𝗏 commented, looking eager to change the topic of conversation. "Deku means useless," I said evenly, not looking the cheerful girl in the eye. The kanji for Izuku can also be interpreted as Deku, so Bakugo had the bright idea that Deku should be my new nickname. "Oh, I see." 𝗧𝗧𝗏 looked deep in thought for a moment before smiling brightly. "But you know, it kinda sounds like Dekaroo, the kanji for you can do it." "I like it." My eyes widened, and I couldn't help but gawk at 𝗧𝗧𝗏. "This girl is too cheerful." "I appreciate the thought, 𝗧𝗧𝗏-san." I smiled gently at the bubbly girl, but made no effort to hide the pain in my eyes. "That does make me feel better, but I'd still prefer not to be called that." "Well, all right." 𝗧𝗧𝗏 looked downtrodden for a moment, before brightening up again and moving the conversation in another direction for the remainder of the lunch period. "And finally in the afternoon, we had hero basic training. I am here." I grinned to myself as excitement buzzed around the classroom. Coming through the door like a normal person, All Might yanked the door open and leaned through, his cape flapping dramatically around him. PFFT. That's not how a normal person goes through a door at all. I snickered to myself as my mentor strutted up to the podium in the front of the room. "Wow, it's really All Might. Isn't that his Silver Age costume? So the number one hero really is a teacher? Huh, I've been brought in to teach basic training," All Might stated confidently, silencing the gossip around the room. "As the name suggests, this class will teach you the basics of being a hero. Unlike other subjects, this class will take your entire afternoon block. There's plenty of time, but let's get right into it. Today's lesson will be combat training." Combat training, right off the bat. In front of me, Bakugo was practically vibrating with excitement. Off to the left, several gears whirred to life, and panels pushed out away from the walls. Within those panels were suitcases, each labeled with a bright green number. "These are your costumes, custom made based on your requests and registrations." All Might laughed heartily as the students began to buzz with excitement. "Find your costumes and report to ground beta for the day's training." With that, the number one hero marched out the door, leaving us to make heads or tails of the numbered suitcases. When I finally got my own case, I set it down on a desk and opened it up, smiling with nostalgia as I looked at the garments within. I shut the case and hurried off to the changing room. My costume was, for the most part, very simple. My shirt was plain black, no extra designs, as were my slacks. My belt and boots were both black with gray buckles. My long coat was a bit fancier, stretching down to my ankles, and trimmed in several places with white lines. The neck of the coat was stretched upwards, and flared out just a bit. On the right side of the chest, there was a three-way split buckle, with a binding harness that let me attach support items to my back. 𝗧𝗵𝗃 helped me design my support items. They appeared to be swords at first glance, but were actually closer to stun batons that I could run my electricity through. Of course, the pommels and guards matched the designs of my old elucidator in dark repulsor. I couldn't help but smile to myself as I hefted the items, testing the weight. Only a little bit lighter than I'm used to. I stopped by the bathroom to wet my hair, matting it down from the wild bush it normally was, then headed out to ground beta. As I stepped out of the tunnel, I couldn't help but notice that this was the same area that my entrance exam had taken place. "Oh, there you are," chirped a bubbly voice, pulling me out of my musing. I turned and saw 𝗬𝗎𝗧𝗏 smiling brightly at me, waving me over to where she stood with 𝗧𝗏 and 𝗔𝗂𝗁. I studied 𝗧𝗏 first. His costume was simple, but specific in its design, with silver mecha armor lined over rough black material. 𝗧𝗏 looked like a cross between a knight and a car in human form, fitting for his quirk. 𝗔𝗂𝗁's costume fit her personality perfectly, from what I could tell. She was dressed in black jeans and a salmon shirt with tears at the top and bottom. Her jacket was cropped, shortened to her waist, and she wore white fingerless gloves. Finally, her thick boots looked like they had speakers built into the fronts. 𝗬𝗎𝗏𝗧's costume made me blush, just a little bit. It wasn't revealing by any means, a full-body skin suit, but it was tight enough that it left none of her curves to the imagination. Her belt, wrist guards, and boots were all pink, and thickened to excess, looking uncomfortable to wear. The skin suit itself was mostly black, with pink shoulders and midriff. So this is what 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looks like. 𝗧𝗏's voice pulled me out of my analysis, and I saw the bespectacled boy looking me over with his own critical eye. 𝗔𝗂𝗁 turned to inspect a moment later, and had a strange look on her face as she looked me over. I looked away, scratching my cheek, somewhat embarrassed at the sudden attention. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes and recentered my thoughts. When I opened my eyes again, I put on a somber face and pretended that I was back in 𝗬𝗏. This is what 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looks like. With the aura I gave off, the reaction was immediate. 𝗔𝗂𝗁 took an unconscious step back. 𝗧𝗏 grimaced and 𝗬𝗎𝗏 shot me a concerned look. "Attention, young men and women." All Might's booming voice caught everyone's attention. "It's time to begin today's training. Sensei," 𝗧𝗏 called out, raising his hand. "This is one of the battlegrounds from the practical exam, is it not? Will we be conducting mock urban battles again?" "We will not, young 𝗧𝗏." All Might paused for a moment to collect his thoughts. If you look at the statistics, it can be seen that most villain encounters take place indoors. In today's age, the most intelligent villains will hide themselves in dark holes and shadows. In today's training, you'll be paired up and fight against each other in 2-on-2 indoor battles, heroes versus villains style. All Might clenched a fist in front of him dramatically. "What are the win and loss conditions?" asked the black-haired ponytail girl, 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏. "Do we get to crush them anyways?" Bakugo growled. "We won't be expelled for losing, will we?" 𝗬𝗎𝗏𝗃 asked worriedly. "How will team composition be determined?" 𝗧𝗏 asked, raising his hand again. "Isn't this cape just fabulous?" asked a blonde boy near me. I turned and raised an eyebrow at him in disbelief, and he just posed dramatically. "NNNGH, one at a time please." All Might sounded flustered, clearly unused to the idea of teaching a full class. Then again, he's really not used to teaching at all, if my own time with him is any indication. Here's the situation. All Might pulled a small stack of note cards and looked them over. The villains have obtained a nuclear weapon, and are storing it somewhere within their hideout. The hero's objective is to dispose of the bomb. If the villains get caught, or the bomb is obtained, the heroes will win this exercise. The villain's objective is to protect the bomb. If the heroes are caught, or the timer runs out, the villains will win. "How long is the timer?" asked the red-haired teen, 𝗕𝗁𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏. 15 minutes. All Might answered after consulting his notes. "I'll be drawing lots to determine team composition, as well as team oppositions. At random, then." 𝗧𝗏 tutted, furrowing his eyebrows in contemplation as All Might shook the lottery box. "It makes sense," I commented, drawing 𝗧𝗏's attention. "Pros often have to work with heroes they don't know very well." 𝗧𝗏 looked thoughtful at the idea, and nodded in agreement. I focused my attention back on All Might as the hero began pulling names and calling the teams. Team A, Todoroki Shoto and Hagakure Toru. Team B, Kudakuji and Asuitsuyu. Team C, Takoyami Fumikiage and Shoji Mezu. Team D, 𝗕𝗫𝗁𝗁𝗏 and 𝗧𝗵𝗵𝗃 Team E, 𝗕𝗗𝗫𝗁𝗏 and 𝗬𝗵𝗃𝗃 Team F, 𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃 and 𝗬𝗫𝗁𝗏 Team G, 𝗕𝗫𝗁𝗏 and 𝗬𝗫𝗁𝗏 Team H, 𝗕𝗫𝗁𝗏 and 𝗧𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗏 Team I, 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗁𝗏 and 𝗕𝗫𝗁𝗏 Team J, Midoriya Izuku. Of course, I'm the one on my own. Sensei, Ida called, once again raising his hand. I can't help but notice that Midoriya-kun is on a team by himself. Wouldn't it be better to dissolve that team and add him to another? It's fine, Ida-kun, I answered before All Might could. It's better this way, I think. I'm used to fighting solo. I smiled at the bespectacled boy determinedly, and All Might seemed to accept the answer. If you're sure, young Midoriya, All Might said, concerned at my lack of worry. All was silent for a moment before the top hero began drawing lots for opposition composition. You sure you'll be all right? Gyro asked, glancing at me worriedly. I just smiled softly at her as our classmates mingled and tried to find their partners. This is what I'm used to, I said simply, before setting my gaze ahead. Gyro didn't look convinced at all, but said nothing else as she went in search of her partner. Now then, these teams will be fighting first. All Might yelled dramatically as he dug his hands into a pair of boxes. One was black and had villain written on the front, and the other box was white with hero written on the front. After a moment of tension, the top hero pulled a pair of balls from the boxes. Team D will be villains, and Team E will be heroes. The two teams stepped forward at their mention. Gyro was paired up with 𝗓𝗵𝗵𝗃, a girl with pink skin and hair and black eyes. Her costume was a bodysuit with a low cut and no shoulders, revealing a fair amount of cleavage, and was patterned with blue and purple camouflage. She also had a tan mini coat, with fur lined at the neck. 𝗓𝗏𝗄's demeanor made her stand out, and I got the distinct life of the party vibe from her. On the other side was the blonde boy with the cape from earlier. Aoyama Yuuga wore red glasses that stretched out and curved upwards. Like Ida, he wore silver plate armor, but it looked closer to a historical knight as compared to Ida's mecha design. Aoyama's chest piece also had an orb of some kind attached to his stomach, and his glittery purple cape was billowing in the wind dramatically. I have to admit, that cape is actually fabulous. Next to Aoyama stood his partner, 𝗬𝗫𝗁𝗏. 𝗬𝗫 was a relatively plain-looking boy, his black hair combed neatly behind his head, leaving his unremarkable face unhidden. His costume was plain as well, just a one-piece outfit in mostly black and white, and gold-colored shoulder guards that matched the shape of his elbows. His helmet was pretty cool, in my opinion, looking like a futuristic motorcycle helmet with a gold-angled chin guard. All Might finished his instruction of the teams, giving them each a device to check the time left in the match, then ushered the remaining students to the observation room. From what I could tell, the villains would have 5 minutes to prepare for the match, and then 15 minutes to defend the objective. Each match would be held in different buildings, each with a different layout. By the time we reached the observation room, only a minute remained before the start of the first match. Ashido was spraying some kind of liquid from her hands, coating the floors and stairs. Gyro was crouched next to the window near the bomb, looking down at 𝗬𝗫 and Aoyama, who were just outside the entrance. It looked like they were discussing strategy, but without sound, I couldn't be sure. Midoriya-san, 𝗧𝗏𝗏 greeted softly. Hello, 𝗧𝗏𝗏san, I returned with a polite smile, looking back up at the board as All Might called for the start of the match. Aoyama took point into the building, 𝗬𝗏 right behind him. I'm curious about something. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 clasped her hands together in front of her stomach, looking apprehensive about something. At lunch today, it appeared to me that you and Asuna-chan are close. I regarded the dignified girl for a moment, noticing how she kept her eyes on the screen. Asuna is my best friend, I said confidently. We met in Sao and fought together many times. That prompted a look that crossed between surprise and sadness. I see, 𝗧𝗏𝗏 said, looking down for a moment. We grew up together. Our parents, while not exactly friends, have attended many of the same events. Asuna-chan was a constant presence for a long time, and she's like a sister to me. Returning to the real world was her biggest motivation to fight, I said, adopting a wistful expression. I'm glad she had someone like you to return to. I smiled broadly at 𝗧𝗏𝗏. Indeed, the girl said with a gentle smile, wiping at her eyes. Though I have you to thank for that, don't I? She came back because you were watching out for her. I snorted at that. You have it backwards, I said bemusedly. Asuna was watching out for me more often than anything else. 𝗧𝗏𝗏 giggled at that, and we turned back to the screen in time to see 𝗬𝗏 slip on the stairs. On another screen, Gyro was smirking, and had one of her jacks jammed into a wall. Can she use those to hear through walls? Watching Aoyama and 𝗬𝗏 try to navigate whatever substance Ashido had put down was, for some reason, rather amusing. Because of the tough terrain and the hero team's snail pace, there was only a couple minutes left by the time they reached the villain team. With a quick glance, Aoyama stepped into the door frame and thrust it. It looked kind of tacky for a half-second, before his laser blasted into the room, separating Ashido and Gyro. 𝗬𝗏 charged in a moment later, pointing his elbow at Ishido and firing tape at the pink girl, binding her arms to her chest. Meanwhile, Aoyama thrusted another laser in Gyro's direction. The punk-themed girl rolled out of the way, landing in a crouch. Before the flamboyant blonde could fire another laser, Gyro extended one of her jacks down to her boots and plugged it in. The effect was immediate, if not visible. Whatever it did, knocked everyone else off of their feet. Ishido took the opportunity to break free of her bindings, using that strange substance to melt through the tape. Must be some kind of acid. It didn't do any damage to the heroes on their way up. Can she control the potency? It was all over moments later. Whatever Gyro did had the hero team out of sorts, and the villain team used the opening to bind them with capture tape. Villain team wins. All Might called over the intercom. All of you, head up to the observation room. Nice job, I praised Gyro, grinning at her as she walked in the door, trailing behind Ishido and the hero team. The punk-themed girl smirked and flashed a thumbs up, but didn't say anything otherwise. All Might launched into a critique on the battle, offering bits of advice to all involved. 𝗧𝗪𝗎𝗀 offered a deeper analysis, much more in-depth than what the top hero had done, which appeared to unnerve him a bit. It wasn't long before the next teams were sent out. Kirishima and Sato, the two buff manly men of the class, were the next villains, with Tokoyami and Shoji as the infiltrating heroes. The villain team fought valiantly, but sticking to straightforward offense in place of a defense led to their undoing. Shoji's multiple arms easily detected the objective's location, and between him and Tokoyami's dark shadow, victory for the hero team was all but assured. Next up was hero team Ajiro and Uraraka against villain team Kaminari and 𝗧𝗪𝗎𝗀. From the way he moved, I could tell that Ajiro was a trained martial artist, and between him and Uraraka, the hero team was looking good on offense. 𝗧𝗪𝗎𝗀 turned out to be the brains of the lot, though, especially after Kaminari unleashed a massive torrent of electrical energy. Given my own quirk, I was almost impressed until I noticed what it did to the blonde-haired boy. Apparently, going too far with his quirk turned Kaminari brain dead for a short period of time. That's going to take some work to fix. 𝗧𝗪𝗎𝗀 likely hadn't planned on it happening, but used it to her advantage regardless. Kaminari went all out on both Ajiro and Uraraka, and it dazed them long enough for the creation quirk user to subdue them, earning the villain team's victory. The fourth fight of the day was very short, but certainly impressive in its own right. Asui and Kuda were set as the hero team, while Todoroki and 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗁 played defense as villains. The villain's plan was simple. 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗁 would sneak down and watch the heroes, and signal Todoroki when they entered the building. Once signaled, Todoroki would freeze the entire building, stopping the heroes in their tracks. Then, finally, 𝗧𝗪𝗀𝗁 would use her capture tape to subdue Asui and Kuda. It was super effective. Thankfully, Todoroki's quirk also let him heat the building back up, freeing his trapped classmates. He had referred to it as half hot, half cold. A dual quirk is certainly rare. With that match over with, it was time for the moment I'd been dreading all afternoon. I'd hoped beyond hope that I wouldn't have to deal with this so soon. But when the fourth match came and went, and neither of us had been called up, I knew that I'd be facing Bakugo Katsuki in battle. She knew it too, given the looks of challenge that she'd been shooting my way. Since I was fighting solo, I was given a small boon to help even the odds. My match would have a 20-minute timer instead of only 15 minutes. I wasn't sure how to feel about that, but I'd take it anyway. And finally, with my heart hammering in my chest, it was time to start. And now, the final match of the day. Midoriya Izuku versus Bakugo Katsuki and Ida Tenya. Start. Instead of heading in through the front door, I stepped into the alley around the side. I grinned to myself when I found what I was looking for, the building's breaker box. With a carefully aimed punch, I shot a megawatt hammer, blowing the breaker box to bits. No more power for them. Without the breaker box, the lights in the building would go dark, forcing my opponents to stay near windows if they wanted to see. It was also a double-edged sword, in that without power, I could only rely on what I had in reserve when I went in. Luckily, that was why I had my support items, a fence without actively draining my reserves. I scaled up some boxes into a second-story window, stepping as lightly as I could. There were never any stealth sections in Aincrad, so sneaking was entirely foreign to me. Then again, it may be more wise to just charge in. Knowing Bakugo, she'd probably leave Ida to guard the bomb and would be gunning it straight for me. I shivered in anticipation for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. Fighting Bakugo now, after our history, was not something I wanted. I shook my head and checked the timer. Only a single minute had passed. I pushed myself to my feet with a grimace and drew the elucidator. With barely a moment of hesitation, I sparked the blade up to make light and set off down the dark hallway. Out of nowhere, the hairs on the back of my head stood on end, and I sprung backward just in time to avoid being blown up by Bakugo's sudden arrival. "Oh, come on, Deku," Bakugo snarled fiercely, stepping forward menacingly in the poor lighting. "You're not supposed to dodge." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. This was exactly why I didn't want to fight 𝗵𝗃𝗁. She would take my attempt to fight as a personal insult. Despite the annoyance creeping in my gut, I just held the elucidator in front of me, ready to get on with the fight. If I remember right, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 starts with a big right hook. The ashen blonde growled, lunging forward at me with the fabled right hook, an explosion already crackling in her palm. I readied the elucidator, filling it with as much electricity as I could, and swung hard. Slant, a single diagonal strike. Slant was a sword skill that I used frequently in 𝗬𝗏. With the electricity I'd pumped into the elucidator, I was able to use my quirk to move it just as much as my arm, effectively doubling speed and power. It was non-restrictive with direction, and this time I chose an upward, right-to-left path, knocking 𝗵𝗃𝗁's grenade-shaped gauntlet away with enough force that the ashen blonde girl stumbled backwards in surprise. I wasted no time with my riposte. Rage spike. I lunged at 𝗵𝗃𝗁, elucidator held low, before swinging upward as hard as I could. The tip of my weapon connected with 𝗵𝗃𝗁's chin with a loud meaty thwack. With the increased power behind the swing, the ashen blonde achieved liftoff, soaring backwards a fair few feet and landing on her back. That caught her by surprise, but I really doubt it was enough to win. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 just laid there dumbly for a moment before sitting up and staring at me. She wore a look of utter disbelief, as if the last few seconds were completely incomprehensible to her. What the fuck was that? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 asked incredulously, slowly rising to her feet. I could tell she was shaken up. The hit to her chin would have done the most damage, and I worried for a moment that I might have given her a concussion. Given that we were in a fight, I was tempted not to answer, but I figured that would just anger the girl more than was necessary. 𝗬𝗏 sword skills, adapted to the real world using my quirk, I said simply, readying the elucidator in my hand. Don't forget, 𝗵𝗃𝗁. I spent 2 years fighting for my life. I'm not going to make this easy for you. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 narrowed her eyes, growling dangerously, but stopped short at a clicking noise in one of her gauntlets. The ashen blonde raised the gauntlet in question, then grinned wildly. It's loaded. That sounds bad. And what does that mean? I asked, almost afraid of the answer. Did you know that I sweat nitroglycerin? 𝗵𝗃𝗁 almost sounded casual with the question, and that unnerved me. You probably knew that, with all your analysis stalking. You see, these gauntlets can absorb that nitroglycerin, and when they're full, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 trailed off, grinning wildly as she pointed the gauntlet's tip in my direction. What looked like the end of a cannon could be seen, and a firing pin appeared when the ashen blonde pulled a piece of metal. Well, shit, don't underestimate me, Deku. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 pulled the pin, and I paled at the size of the explosion that was unleashed. I had just enough time to put up my polarity wall, but the quick job made it weak, and it broke quickly under the massive strain. Thankfully, it took the brunt of the damage, but I was still knocked back a few dozen feet. I rolled to a stop near the window that I had climbed through, with my back towards 𝗵𝗃𝗁. I was definitely hurting all over, and as I laid there on the ground, I decided to see how well playing dead would work. Young Midoriya, are you all right? All Might shouted in my ear. I could hear 𝗵𝗃𝗁 approaching cautiously, so I'd have to be careful with my response. I'm good. Playing dead, I whispered into the comm unit, my hand tight around elucidator's hilt. My free hand reached into my coat and pulled out the capture tape. 𝗵𝗃𝗁's footsteps were nearly upon me. I only get one shot at this. This wouldn't be over until All Might called the end. Since I had confirmed to him that I was still good, I knew that 𝗵𝗃𝗁 would be forced to use her capture tape if she wanted to win. There would be a brief window where she let her guard down, and I'd have to take her by surprise and use my own tape if I wanted to get by her. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 stopped and stood over me. My heart hammered in my chest, and it was all I could do to keep my breathing even. After what felt like an eternity, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 finally shifted in some way, and I took the opportunity to strike. I kicked a leg back, twisting my body around to take out 𝗵𝗃𝗁's balance. In a stroke of good luck, the move worked, and the ashen blonde fell to the ground in a heap with a strangled shout. Letting go of the elucidator, I pushed 𝗵𝗃𝗁's legs together and wrapped the capture tape around her shins, taking an angry explosion to the side in the process. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 has been captured, and is out of the fight. All Might's voice rang out in my ears, and I heaved a sigh of relief. Deku, you sneaky little fuck, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 screamed, looking almost betrayed by the tactic I'd used. I just shot her a sardonic grin as I untied her legs. What the fuck do you think you're doing with that 𝗵𝗃𝗁 bullshit? Whatever it takes to win, 𝗵𝗃𝗁. My tone was quiet, but sharp. I stood, retrieving the elucidator and offering 𝗵𝗃𝗁 a hand. As expected, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 just slapped it away and stood by herself. Fuck you, she snarled, heading in the direction of the exit. At least she'd have time to cool off before I saw her again. I shook my head and checked the timer. 13 minutes left on the clock. I sheathed the elucidator and set off in search of a way up, sparking my arms to light my way in the darkness. Picking up my pace, I searched through the building as carefully as I could. It was a time-consuming effort, but it wasn't too long before I found Ada and the bomb. As I expected, he had set up in a room with windows. Given the nearby building placement, even the sunlight wasn't very bright. Even from the end of the hallway that led to the bomb room, I could see 𝗧𝗧 looking around cautiously, and that he hadn't noticed me yet. I stopped sparking, killing the light that I was giving off, concealing myself entirely in the darkness. Waiting for just a moment, I started walking down the hallway towards my armored opponent, making a point to clack my boots against the floor to draw his attention. 𝗧𝗧's head snapped in my direction at the sound, and I could almost see a bead of sweat on his forehead. As I stepped out of the shadows, I adopted a blank expression and drew the elucidator in a slow motion, drawing out the sound for maximum effect. Midoriya-kun. 𝗧𝗧 sounded rather unnerved. I pulled up the timer again, then showed it to him. 9 minutes left on the clock. 𝗧𝗧 audibly swallowed at that, taking a step back as I lowered the timer again. I had plenty of time to finish this up, but I still wanted to finish it quickly. Drawing the dark repulsor, I readied myself in a combat stance, both blades primed and ready. Think you can last the full 9 minutes, 𝗧𝗧-kun. 𝗧𝗧 made the first move in our duel, activating his quirk. 𝗧𝗧 blasted towards me, sending a high-powered kick towards my head. I managed to duck under it, dodging past his leg and spinning to prime my next sword skill, double circular. I flooded my blades with electricity and swung my blades in parallel, both striking my armored opponent's side in the same instant. With his heavy armor, 𝗧𝗧 didn't move very far from the high-powered strike. Even still, he was knocked off balanced and tumbled into a nearby pillar. I turned and dashed towards the bomb. All I needed to do was lay a hand on it, and the win would be mine. Unfortunately, 𝗧𝗧 was able to recover and move the bomb beyond my reach. Not so fast, hero, 𝗧𝗧 called, apparently trying to get into character, but still coming off as rather nervous. I narrowed my eyes at him, saying nothing as I considered my options. My sword skills wouldn't be of much use against a heavily armored opponent like 𝗧𝗧. On the other hand, my more powerful electrical moves could damage the objective. 𝗧𝗧 took the opportunity to launch a flurry of kicks aimed at various places, forcing me to dodge backwards away from the bomb. I settled dark repulsor back in its sheath as I decided on a strategy. With the elucidator in one hand, and my capture tape in the other, I charged. Howling octave, I lunged at 𝗧𝗧, aiming a series of 5 thrusts at various points on his body. My armored opponent managed to dodge most of them, only taking the last thrust to his shoulder, but it was enough to stun him as I launched into the second half of the sword skill. I twisted around for momentum, then brought the elucidator down for a hard downward slash on 𝗧𝗧's shoulder. Twisting back around, I brought the weapon up again in an uppercut, aimed at his arm. With a pirouette, I launched a final brutal uppercut to the boy's chin. Just as with Bakugo before him, 𝗧𝗧 managed to get some airtime, and I was moving in on him before he landed. Dropping the elucidator on the ground, I crouched down and tied 𝗧𝗧's hands together with my capture tape, ending the fight. 𝗧𝗧 has been captured. Hero team wins. All Might's voice rang out as 𝗧𝗧 sat up in a daze. Midoriya-kun. 𝗧𝗧 looked up at me blearily, then down at his bindings, which I promptly undid. What just happened? I scratched my cheek awkwardly, not really sure how to answer. Sorry, 𝗧𝗧-kun, I murmured, feeling somewhat embarrassed now that the fight was over. Let's get back up to the observation room so we can look over the footage. I offered my armored friend a hand, and pulled him to his feet, using my quirk to light the way. 𝗧𝗧 and I set off towards the exit. Katsuki wasn't having a very good day. It was bad enough that the chestnut girl got on her case at lunch, and having to wait for the entire afternoon for her turn in combat was wearing her already thin patience down to dust. To make matters worse, she got stuck with 4 eyes for a partner and had to fight fucking Deku. To top it all off, Deku didn't even have a goddamn teammate, almost as if fucking Yua itself thought he would be enough to challenge Katsuki by himself. And then, the bastard went and beat Katsuki by himself, and then went on to win the match entirely by himself. Katsuki was going to have a fucking stroke. She kept to herself in a back corner when Deku and 4 Eyes got back to the observation room, and scowled as the entire rest of the class kept shouting praises at the green-haired brat. Katsuki would be glad when All Might reined the loud-ass people in for the analysis, which he took entirely too long to do. Now, can anyone tell me who the MVP was for this match? All Might asked, looking around the room. Given the irregular parameters, it's difficult to say. Given the performance, however, I believe that Midoriya-san was the clear star of this match, Ponytail said evenly, speaking in that analytical tone that she'd kept up the entire afternoon. He created an advantage for himself by putting the lights out, and defeated his opponents quickly and efficiently. That's true and all, but what about that sneak attack? Not very manly, if you asked me. Shitty Hair spoke up with a concerned look, getting a couple nods of agreement from the others. And what if it's the only winning strategy? Deku asked, crossing his arms and shooting Shitty Hair a pointed look. Will you stick to your guns even if it means you might lose? What if it means you let innocent people die for it? No one had an answer for that. Of course they fucking didn't. Even 𝗕𝗁𝗏 looked kinda guilty over it. It's admirable to try and stay true to your ideals, All Might said, nodding sagely. But the safety of the people must always come first, even if it must cost your ideals. Katsuki rolled her eyes and said nothing. She wasn't here to save people. She was here to win, to be on top. Katsuki's attention was drawn to the class again when Frogface decided to speak up. I'm told I can be very blunt, Kiro, she said in her weird frog voice. I always say what's on my mind. Where did you learn to fight like that, Midoriya-chan? I'd like to know that too, said Tails. I've seen a lot of sword styles, but never anything like what you've done. Yeah, your moves were totally badass, Pikachu shouted, pumping a fist in the air enthusiastically. Katsuki grimaced to herself as she watched Deku uncross his arms with a resigned sigh. It wasn't long before most of the class had joined in. Roundface and Four Eyes exchanged worried glances, and Ears looked like she was about to bite through her lip. You bastards wouldn't be so cheerful if you knew the fucking answer. I learned to fight like that in 𝗬𝗏. Deku scratched the back of his head awkwardly as the entire class went silent, and his face was somber as he continued. I've already been in real, life-or-death fights. That's all my life was, every day and all day, for 2 years. Shit, sorry man, 𝗕𝗁𝗏 offered, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. Deku just waved it off, smiling somberly. No one else had anything to say after that, so All Might was quick to wrap things up and send the class back. Katsuki ignored the other girls while she changed, and slipped back to the classroom before anyone else could get there. Katsuki was lost in her thoughts by the time the rest of the class showed up. The last hour or so of the day was supposed to be a study hall, but the ashen blonde girl found she couldn't focus on her work at all. You don't need a quirk to be dangerous, Bakugo-san. Katsuki knew that now more than ever. It had pissed her off to hear the first time, and kept confusing her the more she thought about it. Deku had saved her without his quirk, and then barely used it today. Your hands free. Blast, now. In seconds, Deku had done more than the heroes had in 10 minutes. Katsuki didn't want to think about the look in his eyes at that moment. There was a history behind that look, a chain of events that had created the pain and fear that drove him that day. You treated him like dirt. Katsuki couldn't stop thinking about that, even long before the chestnut girl brought it up. The old Deku was a stuttering mess, and could barely form words, let alone sentences. Katsuki had always thought that Deku was just weird, that his nervous nature would never let him walk the path of heroics. But seeing Deku now made Katsuki wonder. If left alone, the old Deku would keep to himself and seem content. It was only when Katsuki got involved that the nervous wreck came out. Because of Katsuki's treatment, Deku retreated inwards. Katsuki had all but forced Deku to be an introvert, had pushed him to using games as a form of escapism. It's my fault he got trapped in 𝗬𝗏. Oi, Bakugo. 𝗕𝗁𝗏's loud voice caught Katsuki's attention, dragging her out of her thoughts. You good? School's out and you're just spacing. Yeah, I'm good, Katsuki answered curtly, packing her stuff up. She stood up with a stretch, looking around the room and pausing. Where'd Deku go? He left already, Roundface supplied when 𝗕𝗁𝗏 just looked confused. Katsuki looked at Deku's empty seat, feeling an itch in the back of her mind. Everyone else was still packing up, so Deku must have been ready to go right on time. Before she had a chance to think, Katsuki was out the door and running down the hall. What the hell am I doing? Katsuki would never admit it, but she blamed herself. She tried to hide it, to put up anger and contempt as a front, but she knew it deep down. Deku's history of pain began with Katsuki. He was at the front gate by the time Katsuki caught up to him. She paused for a moment, watching him walk away, her mind racing a mile a minute. For a moment, she had no idea what to say. Deku, Katsuki called out to him, taking a step forward, only to be stopped by a flash of lightning that whizzed over her shoulder. Would you stop calling me that? Deku shouted back at her, staring her down with the same intensity as during their fight. Katsuki just stared back, her mouth hanging open in surprise. I'm not fucking useless. I know you don't like me, but can you really not just give up on that stupid nickname? I stopped being Deku a long time ago. I don't. Katsuki was at a loss for words. She was surprised to see this side of Deku, but she supposed that she really shouldn't be. Deku scratched the back of his head awkwardly, looking off to the side. Asuna was right earlier, you know. But I'm willing to forgive and forget, if only as a means to move on. So just leave me alone, would you? Deku turned and walked away, leaving Katsuki alone in the courtyard. Katsuki stared at his back as he went, not knowing how to deal with whatever she was feeling. When Deku was gone from her sight, Katsuki allowed a single tear to slip down her cheek. I just wanted to apologize. Apparently, the news that All Might had been hired as a teacher at 𝗬𝗏 had surprised just about everyone in the nation. Unsurprisingly, this stirred up the hornet's nest that is the news media, and every single outlet wanted every piece of information they could get their hands on. What's it like having the #1 hero as a teacher? Which apparently wasn't very much at all, considering the crowd of reporters I could see outside the front gate. Some students were able to slip through, but some poor souls managed to get hailed down and trapped in the crowd. As I approached, I could see 𝗧𝗏 and 𝗬𝗧𝗏𝗏 both giving vague and not very helpful comments, to the point that they were just dismissed and let through. I just hunched my shoulders and slid through, mostly unnoticed, much to the surprise of my hapless friends. "Whoa, how'd you do that, Midoriya-kun?" 𝗬𝗧𝗏𝗏 asked, eyes wide with disbelief and clearly a bit shaken from being crowded around. "It's like they didn't even see you." "I spent most of my time in 𝗬𝗏 as a solo player," I commented with a wry smile. "One of the perks there is that I know how to get through a crowd without being harassed." As 𝗧𝗏 opened his mouth to comment, the sound of a loud alarm drew our attention back to the gate. The ground rumbled for a moment, and a series of metal plates rose up to form a large defensive barrier in front of the gate and beyond to the outer walls. Our tired homeroom teacher could be seen turning away from the metal barrier, his usual deadpan expression firmly in place. "A defense mechanism to prevent intruders," droned Aizawa-sensei as he walked by us, having noticed our incredulous stares. "Now get to class. Time is limited." With an exasperated sigh, I turned toward the building, only to see Bakugo at the door, staring back at me with a complicated expression on her face. Our eyes locked for a brief moment, before she turned and disappeared into the building without a word. "What's that about?" 𝗧𝗏 asked, looking between me and the door Bakugo was just standing in. I just shook my head and walked inside without saying anything, leaving my perplexed friends to trail behind me. "Good work with your first combat exercises yesterday," said Aizawa as he addressed the class for his morning lecture. "Most of you performed really well, but a few of you still have a ways to go yet." "Midoriya," I stiffened very slightly as he addressed me directly. "Go a little easier on your classmates. This is a class, not a competition. Winning and losing don't mean a thing if they don't learn from it." "I'll tone it down, sir," I acknowledged with a nod. "Good then." Aizawa glanced over his papers one more time, before setting them to the side. "Now, let's get straight to business." Suddenly, a sense of dread filled the room as everyone waited in anticipation. "You need to decide on a class rep." And just like that, the tension popped. The room very quickly erupted in shouts, everyone practically climbing over each other for the position. In a move that I couldn't decide whether it was characteristic or not, Aizawa's only response was that he didn't care who he picked, and climbing into his sleeping bag. Surprisingly, it was 𝗧𝗏 who came to the rescue. "Everyone, be silent," 𝗧𝗏 called, silencing the room and attracting everyone's attention. "The class rep position is one of serious responsibility. Just wanting it doesn't make you qualified for it. You have to be able to lead others. That kind of leadership is born only from the trust of those you lead. Thus, the representative should be chosen in a vote in which we cannot vote for ourselves." Silence followed for a moment, before murmurs of agreement ran through the class. I just sat back with a small smile. It was easy to tell that 𝗧𝗏 wanted the position most of all, but his speech was enough for me to think he'd be qualified for it as well. He'd have my vote, at least. Within minutes, everyone passed their votes up and the score was tallied by Aizawa-sensei. "Midoriya Izuku is the class rep, with 4 votes, he droned, and I raised an eyebrow in response. 4 votes. Assistant rep is Yaoyorozu Momo, with 3 votes. Yaoyorozu and I took our places at the front of the room, and I took the opportunity to look around at everyone's reactions. Somehow, the majority seemed content with this outcome. Bakugo, who I knew would gun straight for a position of leadership like this, was just staring out the window, uncaring. 𝗧𝗏's frustration was obvious, though he seemed resigned to it. Yaoyorozu and I shared a quick glance, and I cleared my throat to address the class. "How in the hell did I get the most votes?" I asked bluntly, throwing just about everyone for a loop. "Because you've got the most experience," Bakugo spoke up, silencing the confusion and humorous banter that I'd sparked with my blunt question. I gave her an incredulous look, and was met with a deadpan stare in return. "You said it yourself. You've fought real fights, every day and all day for 2 fucking years. That's more than any of us can say." But I was blown away. If anyone else had said it, I'd have just brushed it off as being irrelevant. But this was Bakugo. The same girl that had once been my tormentor was now justifying my promotion to a spot that she probably wanted. Just from the way she looked at me, I could almost believe she was one of my 4 votes. In the end, I could only accept that the decision was made. Though I may be loath to admit it, I agree with Bakugo. I looked up at 𝗧𝗏 from my bowl of rice with a curious expression. "My reasons differ, of course," he clarified, setting down his own bowl in favor of speaking his mind. "I voted for you because of your courage and judgment at critical moments. More than that, you have a clear idea of what it means to be a proper hero, at least in comparison to some others in our class." "Okay, but that doesn't mean I'm qualified to be a class rep," I contested after swallowing my rice. "Honestly, I think you'd be better off for it, 𝗧𝗏-kun. At least you seem to want it." "Just because I want to do it doesn't mean I'm suitable," 𝗧𝗏 retorted calmly, eyes focused on the table. I realize you may not be interested in the position, but I would feel more comfortable leaving it in your hands than anyone else's." A quick glance around the table showed that 𝗬𝗧𝗏 and 𝗔𝗂𝘁 agreed with the assessment. I just stared back for a moment before giving my new friends a determined smile. If they chose to believe in me like this, all I could do was try to live up to their expectations. You might regret that decision before long. All eyes snapped over to Asuna, who was wearing a mischievous smile as she joined us at the table. "What do you mean, Asuna-chan?" asked 𝗬𝗧𝗏, seeming a little put off by the joke. I, on the other hand, could only groan. I knew exactly what was about to happen. She'd taken the bait that Asuna had laid out, because of course she did. "You should have seen this slacker," Asuna began, barely able to contain her amusement. "How many times did I find you taking it easy by napping in the sun? Yeah, how about the number of times you decided to join in?" I deflected as 𝗬𝗧𝗏 and 𝗔𝗂𝘁 started giggling. Ada just looked between Asuna and I with a mildly confused expression as we bantered back and forth for the next few minutes, each trying to one-up the other's lazier habits. Out of nowhere, though, a loud ringing sound began to blare throughout the cafeteria. "Level 3 security breach. All students must evacuate the building." "Oh, not another alarm," I cried, lurching to my feet with my hands in my hair. "Not just any alarm," a nearby third-year student exclaimed in our direction. "It's a level 3, that means there's a trespasser. Then someone has managed to break down the security measures we saw this morning," Ada exclaimed, looking rather panicked at the thought. No answer came as we got swept up in the current of students, leaving little room for thought as we were practically dragged out of the cafeteria. Students of all shapes and sizes began pouring into the hallways, all fighting and falling over each other in their haste to evacuate the building. I could feel my heart lurching with every shove and push I took from the students around me. I tried my best to keep tabs on my friends in the mess, but when my eyes locked with 𝗔𝗂𝘁, I was suddenly back in that dungeon on the 27th floor of Aincrad. "Thank you, goodbye," I went on full alert then. And when reality snapped back into place, I began fighting my way through the crowd, trying to gain some semblance of awareness about the situation. Reaching the window and examining the situation outside told me everything I needed to know. The media had somehow found a way to break down the barrier. I almost felt like smacking my head on the glass for how stupid the situation suddenly felt. But a yelp from further up the hall drew my attention. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looked the most panicked out of my friends, but seeing her now gave me an idea. "𝗬𝗧𝗏-san," I called out to her, my chest tightening somewhat at her scared expression. Though I was reminded again of 𝗬, I shook off the feeling as I reached out to my bubbly friend. "Use your quirk, 𝗬𝗧𝗏-san. Make me float." Realization dawned on her face, and after a moment of dramatic reaching, the tips of her fingers brushed past mine. Using my static thrusters, I took to the air, floating over the heads of the panicked ocean of students. "Hey, everyone," I yelled at the top of my lungs, commanding all attention to me. "There's no need to panic. It's only the media." I continued yelling until I was sure everyone around me was calming down. It took time, and my throat was certainly hurting, but the panic eventually died away completely. I nodded to 𝗬𝗧𝗏, who released her quirk, letting me glide to the ground safely. Looking around, I was pleased to see several of my classmates breathing sighs of relief, now aware that the situation wasn't as bad as they'd assumed. With the panic gone, students began filing out of the hallway, and space began to open up once again. My friends crowded around me, praising my actions, but one of them was strangely silent. My eyes locked once again with 𝗔𝗂𝘁, and she looked strangely sad before averting her eyes. Just as I was about to say something to her about it, the intercom came alive again, directing the students back to their classrooms. After a moment's hesitation, I let the matter drop for now and headed back. I'd have to ask her what was wrong another time. "Are you all right, Midoriya-kun?" Ada asked as we stepped out of the building at the end of the day. "You seem rather quiet this afternoon." "I'm fine," I responded, keeping my eyes focused ahead. A little worried about 𝗔𝗂𝘁, though. "I think something's bugging her." "Really? I thought she seemed okay." 𝗬𝗧𝗏 trailed off, looking a little lost in thought. "I thought so too, at first," I commented, fidgeting with the straps of my backpack. "She was totally fine during lunch, right up to the alarm. Maybe something had happened during the hallway panic when I wasn't looking." The three of us shared concerned looks for a moment, before heaving a collective sigh. "Yeah, about that." I practically jumped out of my skin as 𝗔𝗂𝘁's voice came from behind me. I turned to face her, almost wincing at her sullen expression. "Or she'll come to me about it." "Got a sec, Midoriya?" 𝗔𝗂𝘁 asked, twirling one of her jacks around a finger. "There's something I've been wanting to ask. Alone, if you don't mind." I gave her a long look before ushering Ada and 𝗬𝗧𝗏 ahead, with a promise to let them know if something was up later. They shared another worried look before complying, and leaving 𝗔𝗂𝘁 and I alone to talk. And then we were alone in the courtyard. My eyes wandered around a bit, eyeing up the piles of debris from the apparently destroyed defense wall at the gate. My discomfort only grew as the silence dragged on, before I gave up and looked at 𝗔𝗂𝘁 again. Jirou started, still twirling her jack and seeming a little shy all of a sudden. I'm not really sure how to ask this, but she trailed off again, and I began to have an inkling for what she might ask. Do you have a question about 𝗬𝗏? I asked as gently as I could, and Jirou almost flinched at the question. Maybe, Jirou stammered, fidgeting more roughly with her jack. It might be related, but I don't really know, honestly. I almost found Jirou to be cute as her nervousness grew, and after a moment of her being unable to get the words out, I took the Asuna route and poked her in the forehead. Breathe, I commanded gently, smiling as Jirou complied and took a few deep breaths. She almost started to smile back, but stopped when she seemed to remember what she wanted to talk about. The first day of school, Jirou started, shifting from one foot to the other nervously. When you looked at me the first time, you looked completely freaked out, like you saw a ghost, and you agreed with that when I asked, "Oh, I think I know where this is going." And then today, when everyone was panicking, you looked at me like that again. You saw that ghost again, and you want to know why. I finished for her in a quiet, somber tone. Jirou said nothing in response, only staring at me intently as I raked a hand through my hair. My eyes wandered back over the debris as I considered my next words carefully. When I first saw you, I thought you were someone else. You know that part. Jirou nodded in confirmation when I finally looked at her again. And as you said, I agreed that I thought I'd seen a ghost. I'm sure you can guess this part, but I trailed off, somehow unable to finish that statement. You thought I was someone that died. Jirou finished for me, some realization setting in on her face. Yeah, I gave her a subdued nod, melancholy clear on my face. It's more than just that, though. Jirou looked at me curiously, and I marched on with my explanation. Her name was 𝗬𝗏, and we were guildmates in 𝗬𝗏. There were 6 of us in the guild. One day, we went to the local dungeon and got trapped in. Monsters poured in from all sides, crowding around us, and we could barely move. Sound familiar? Just like today. In the hall, Jirou confirmed, appearing to put the pieces together in her head. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I got to the point of my explanation, the part that I'd only ever talked about with one other person. I watched her die. Jirou inhaled sharply as her eyes widened. Tears threatened to fall as my memories played out in my head. You don't look as much like her as I thought at first. But today in the hall, it's like you said. I looked at you and saw her ghost. I'm sorry, Jirou said after a minute of silence, sorrow clear on her face. Don't be, I responded sullenly, prompting the punk-themed girl to glance up at me in confusion. What happened isn't your fault, whether it's from back then or today. If anything, I should apologize for letting it affect you. Still, though, Jirou trailed off when she apparently didn't have a follow-up. I just shook my head and gave her a sad smile, which she returned after a moment, before gesturing towards the gate. Were you guys close? Asked Jirou, keeping her eyes firmly ahead as we left the school grounds. 𝗬𝗏 and I, kind of, but not really. She was one of my closer friends up to then, but nothing more. Maybe, if time had allowed. I trailed off and shook my head roughly, not really wanting to continue that line of thought. After her death, I went back to being a solo player and rarely interacted with people outside my business contacts. Jirou gave a small hum of acknowledgement and dropped the topic of 𝗬𝗏 entirely. We walked along in companionable silence for a few moments, before I remembered something I'd seen at the first representative meeting earlier in the day. So apparently, in the next few days, we're going to have an off-campus training session. The excitement was palpable as our class stood on the curb, awaiting the bus that would take us to the day's training location. Everything from disasters to shipwrecks, and anything else you can imagine, Aizawa had said. Rescue training. It was the form of heroics that I'd admired most since I was very young, and I could barely contain my own anticipation. As the bus arrived, and I began directing my classmates to board, I let my mind wander through the possibilities of what may be in store for us. Once the bus took off, the voice of the frog-like 𝗬𝗏 pulled me from my thoughts. Like I said before, I say whatever comes to mind. 𝗬𝗏 started, before directing her full attention to me. Midoriya-chan. What's up, 𝗬𝗏-san? I responded, shifting Elucidator and Dark Repulsor to more comfortably lean against me. 𝗵𝗃-chan, the frog-like girl said, to which I grunted in confirmation. Your quirk is very similar to Kaminari-chan's. Yeah, I was just thinking that. Kaminari himself remarked. Yours is electrical too, right? But it seems like you can do so much more than me. It's because our quirks are sort of opposites, I commented, going into an analytical mindset. You can generate and unleash large waves of electricity, right? Pretty much, yeah, the blonde-haired boy responded. I'm immune to electrical type damage, too. And I have no control over my electricity once it's out there, you know. My father's quirk was like that, too. My mom's is a very weak telekinesis, so mine is a mix of them, electrokinesis. I have much better control over my electricity, but I can't generate any at all. Pretty flashy stuff, my dude, said Kirishima, flashing a grin up my way. Definitely more flashy than my hardening. I wouldn't worry about that, I chuckled, prompting a curious look from the red-headed boy. Practical is better than flashy, in my opinion. Something like your hardening works great for defending others, and I think that's pretty cool in its own way. Definitely the quirk of a pro hero. A pro's quirk, Kirishima mused, looking his hardened arm up and down. Pros have to worry about popularity too, you know. I think Midoriya, Todoroki, and Bakugo will be the ones that have the best advantage there. Bakugo's always mad about something or another, Asui remarked, prompting the ashen blonde to look up in annoyance. I don't see her being all that popular, really. The fuck are you talking about, frog face? Bakugo snarled, glaring fiercely at Asui. In response, the frog-like girl only put on an I told you so face. I just chuckled again, shaking my head at the antics of my classmates. Bakugo's always been like that, I said wistfully, drawing surprised looks from everyone in earshot. I ran a couple fingers up and down Elucidator's scabbard as I remembered what it was like to be near a younger Bakugo. Anger comes naturally to her, and she'll direct it at anyone she thinks will get in her way, even if only slightly. Shut your fucking trap, Bakugo started, but cut herself off with a strangled noise. I looked over at her confusedly, only to see the anger drain out of her, and she dropped into her seat without another sound. What the shit? Before I could react to what just happened, Aizawa stood up from his spot near the front. Everyone get ready, we're about to arrive. Midoriya-kun, look, it's 13. Uriaraka tugged at my sleeve excitedly, pointing at the space-themed hero in front of us. The space hero, 13, I confirmed, prompting another round of fangirling from Uriaraka. They specialize in search and rescue, and are the lead developer of the USJ training facility. Quite correct, young man. The space-themed hero confirmed with a thumbs up, before ushering the class into the facility. Let's all head inside without any delay. I trotted behind the class, observing the general excitement of my classmates. Uriaraka most of all seemed very excited now that we'd arrived, and I could only assume that 13 was one of her favorite heroes. Once inside, I took a moment to admire the surrounding area, and all of the simulated disasters within. A shipwreck. 13 began their presentation with a level of gusto, a landslide, a fire, and a windstorm, and many more. The purpose of this training ground is to familiarize you with many different types of accidents and disasters. Everyone around began to get fired up, and even I couldn't help but feel excited as 13 continued on. Now, I'm quite certain you're aware of my quirk, Black Hole. Black Hole is a quirk that's able to easily turn things to dust, I summarized as Uriaraka began to steadily vibrate in her place next to me. Her hands clenched into fists in front of her chest. Correct again, young man. But it's also able to easily kill, 13 said somberly. Uriaraka's excitement died out, and I couldn't help but shudder at the dark truth. Even my own electrokinesis could easily kill someone if I so chose. In a superhuman society like ours, every power must be carefully monitored and regulated. Even still, we must all be diligent, for there are many quirks that can easily kill with a single mistake. In past training, you've discovered your own hidden potential, and experience the dangers of using that potential against others. This time, it will be different. This time, you will use your powers to save instead of harm. As the class began to clap and shout praises, Aizawa approached 13 and the two began to talk quietly. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but 13 made a few hand motions and held up what looked like 3 fingers. My classmates began to disperse into smaller groups, meandering past the teachers to get better looks at the area. I found myself standing at the top of the steps with a good overview of the area, just as the lights near the top of the building began to flicker. I have a very bad feeling. That same sense of unease quickly spread around the class, just as I noticed a mass of darkness in the courtyard below. Fear crept up into my gut, and I dropped into battle mode, resting a hand on Elucidator's hilt. On my right side, I noticed Aizawa step up to the edge of the stairs, having apparently noticed my stance. As the darkness spread, covering a larger area, many figures began to step forth from the shadows. There were so many that I couldn't count, but when the dark form shrunk to the shape of a person, I could tell that there were 4 leaders of this villain group. Villains, I noted, gripping Elucidator's hilt ever tighter. Aizawa took a deep breath as he put on his goggles, and turned to address the class. Everyone, gather together and don't move, Aizawa said forcefully, tapping a fist on my shoulder. That means you too, kid. I looked up at my teacher with a desperate look on my face, an unspoken plea to let me help fight, despite probably knowing my past and experience. He still gestured me back. Stay with your friends, class rep. They need you. I just grimaced and stepped back to the group, turning to watch Aizawa throw himself down the steps towards the villain. Aizawa-kun will be alright, 13 consoled me as I rejoined the group. Group fights are his specialty. I was a solo player in 𝗬𝗏, I said tightly, prompting a surprised noise from the space-themed hero. I know better than anyone that group fights like that are the hardest of all, especially for solo fighters. Then you should know well that only someone of great experience would attempt such a fight. I looked at 13 with a pained expression, but accepted that their logic was sound. For now, we must commence with the evacuation. I nodded and turned to lead the group to safety. Before we could make any kind of meaningful distance, however, the mass of darkness from below appeared in front of us. My apologies for this interruption. I am 𝗘𝗁𝗅, and we are the League of Villains. I pushed my way to the front of the group, drawing Elucidator and Dark Repulsor, charging them with electricity as I held them up in a defensive stance. A moment of silence passed before the shadow form, 𝗘𝗁𝗅, spoke again. Our objective is to eliminate the symbol of peace, All Might. However, it would appear that he is not here as he should have been. Has there been a change of scheduling? As 13 readied themselves for combat, they were forced to hesitate as Bakugo and Kirishima lunged out ahead of us to attack 𝗘𝗁𝗅. Bakugo produced a decently sized explosion, but only managed to obscure our line of sight on the villain. Out of the dust cloud, tendrils of darkness appeared and surrounded the class until a great dome of darkness enveloped us. I was barely able to push Uraraka out of the darkness, and I noticed vaguely that Ida was able to escape with 2 others, but the rest of us were forced to hunker down as a group until the darkness closed in. Aizawa 𝗬𝗪 was aware, passingly, of what happened at the entrance plateau. He'd tried to keep tabs on his students, after all, but could only pay so much attention when he'd thrown himself into such a large group of villains. Even still, 𝗬𝗪 could only watch as the warp villain, 𝗘𝗁𝗅, enveloped his fledgling students and scattered them all to the furthest corners of the USJ. By leaving his students behind, 𝗬𝗪 had hoped to distract the villains and keep their attention on him. More than that, there were 2 people he could try to rely on to keep his class safe. 13, of course, was one of them. The other was Midoriya Izuku, 𝗬 survivor and class rep of 1A. 𝗬𝗪 had kept up with the 𝗬 case. Despite not being directly involved, the scale of the case had meant that most underground heroes had access to all the information as it came out. That meant he was well aware of Midoriya's reputation, long before the green-haired boy even applied for UA. The Black Swordsman, hero of Aincrad. If anyone can keep them safe, it's him. Of course, that didn't mean much once the warp villain had gone up and separated everyone. There were still a few students up there, meaning there was still a chance one could escape and call in reinforcements. For now, all he could do was try to thin out the bulk of the villain group here at the courtyard. 𝗬𝗪 cast his eyes in every direction he could, erasing as many quirks as possible as his hair rose up in that familiar sensation of activating his quirk. On the far side of the group, he could see what he assumed to be the leaders of the group. To one side, a large mass of muscled meat was hunched over, its freaky open eyes and exposed brain unnerving for any who looked at it. On the other side was a figure garbed in a baggy trench coat, with what looked like a potato sack drawn over their face, and they seemed to be fidgeting with a pair nasty-looking daggers. At the front of the leader group was a skinny, pale person dressed all in black and covered in what looked like hands. 𝗬𝗪 would have considered it tacky, if not for the fact this was a villain, and so it came across as creepy instead. Creepiness seems to be a running theme. With that bunch, 𝗬𝗪 ducked under a punch, delivering his own elbow as a riposte, sending a petite villain with rotating hair flying. He wondered idly how much time had passed, and as he stopped to examine his surroundings and check the ranks of the opposing side, he noticed the Hands villain running at him. He launched a strand of his capture scarf at the villain, only for it to be caught at the last second as the villain continued his charge. The villain reached out for 𝗬𝗪's face, and he could almost hear a faint 19 seconds uttered as he delivered another powerful elbow into the villain's gut. It was all for naught, though, as the villain didn't seem fazed by it at all. Worse still, 𝗬𝗪 couldn't help but blink, his hair falling down as his quirk shut off once again. You know, there's an instant where your hair falls, the villain said smugly, and all too quickly, an intense pain sprouted from 𝗬𝗪's right elbow. It caught the attack. In that instant, your quirk shuts off, and you have to wait a second to turn it back on again, right? 𝗬𝗪 could only watch as the fabric of his sleeve turned gray and began to crumble like dust. Only when his skin began to do the same did he shake off the confusion and back away from the villain, holding his injured arm. Most importantly, the length of time your hair stays up keeps getting shorter and shorter. The Hands villain began scratching at his throat, a rash clearly visible under his flaky fingers. You shouldn't push yourself, Eraserhead. 𝗬𝗪 could barely dodge under the attack of a villain on his left, striking back with his good hand, and jumping away from 2 more villains that came in at different angles. Before he could even try to think of a way out of this mess, an ominous shadow loomed over him from behind. 𝗬𝗪 turned sharply to look at the giant muscled villain, just in time to see its fist close in on him from above, smashing him into the concrete with a sickening crunch. It was only natural for 𝗕𝗫 to worry. He'd just watched 3/4 of his class get swallowed up by an unnatural darkness. After all, don't worry, Ida-san. From what I can tell, everyone is still in the building, at least. 𝗕𝗫's attention snapped onto the multi-armed 𝗬𝗪, who'd morphed several of his limbs into ears and eyes. But are they okay? 𝗕𝗫 asked, already sure that 𝗬𝗪 didn't know the answer. The rest of those that remained at the plateau were at least reassured by the idea that 𝗬𝗏𝗎 knew their classmates were still around. At least, never mind that. For now, let us focus on the villain blocking our path. His fellow students shouted their agreement and readied themselves for combat, all looking every bit as nervous and scared as Tenya felt. Seems like physical attacks don't work on this guy at all, 𝗧𝗏 commented with a frustrated face. And he's a warp type. Man, this is the worst. At the head of the group, 13 looked around and analyzed the situation before coming to some kind of resolution. Tenya, 13 called out, startling the bespectacled boy. Listen closely. I will create an opening. Use that opening to escape and run to the school. 𝗬𝗏𝗻𝗲 run away and leave you all behind. Tenya shouted, torn between confusion and outrage. It isn't just running away. 𝗬𝗏-kun, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 said calmly, a look of determination set about her face. You're the fastest out of everyone here, so you can go and get back up. She's right, 13 stated, keeping their attention focused on 𝗓𝗁𝗓𝗏, who seemed content to sit and watch the group argue. The alarms are not sounding, and our phones don't seem to have any signal. Running is the only way we ensure the survival of everyone. Before Tenya could come to a decision, 𝗓𝗁𝗓𝗓 prepared an attack, spreading a number of tendrils outward in every direction, before the attack could land in any meaningful way. However, 13 snapped open one of the latches on their fingers and activated their quirk, Black Hole. All at once, 𝗓𝗁𝗓𝗓's tendrils were sucked up into the opening on 13's finger, and the suction was powerful enough to render 𝗓𝗁𝗓𝗓 entirely immobile. Despite agreeing with the logic, the whole plan seemed rather distasteful to Tenya, and he clenched his eyes shut in frustration. That's wrong, though. Tenya's eyes snapped open, and activated his quirk in preparation to blow past the enemy. 𝗬𝗏𝗏-san, make me float, then release your quirk just after I pass by the villain. Foolish children, 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓 said dryly as 𝗬𝗏𝗏 complied, removing the gravity from Tenya and as many pieces of his armor as possible. Isn't it idiotic to announce your plans in front of the enemy? Tenya took to the air, taking a brief moment to acclimate to the free-floating nature of zero gravity. After a moment, he readjusted himself and used his quirk to blast along a path which he believed would take him to the entrance of the building. As promised, gravity returned to him when he passed by the shadowy form of 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓, and he barely noticed the fact that 13's black hole no longer seemed to be affecting the villain. As he landed at the entrance, Tenya spared a look back at the others. His gut twisted in dread as he saw 13 collapsed on the ground, their suit ripped open from the back. All too quickly, 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓 was rushing at the armored boy, spreading out in a cloud of darkness to envelop him. Tenya quickly turned back to the door, trying to reach it and escape, and was surprised when the darkness was lifted from him. A groan from above him prompted Tenya to look up tentatively, and he surmised that 𝗬𝗏𝗏 had somehow managed to use her quirk on the warp villain. Sending a quick smile back at his companions, Tenya ran for the door, pried it open with all his might, and escaped the building. Before the doors snapped shut behind him, Tenya could barely make out the voice of the warp villain. Game over. I am 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓, and we are the League of Villains. Our objective is to eliminate the symbol of peace, All Might. The villain's voice played back in 𝗓𝗓𝗓𝗓's mind as she fell out of the darkness. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw that she'd been transported into the air somehow. Panicking internally, 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 looked around quickly and spotted a familiar black shape just beneath her. By a stroke of complete luck, she fell directly onto the back of Midoriya Izuku and held on for dear life. Oh, hey dude, 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 joked in response to the green bean's yelp of surprise. Resting her chin on Midoriya's shoulder, she became aware of how slowly they were actually descending. I didn't know you could fly. Nah, I can only glide like this, Midoriya responded, increasing the output of electricity from his hands. You're pretty light, so we should be able to get down safely. Might land a bit rough, though. 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 blushed slightly at him calling her light, then shook the thought out of her mind. There are more important things to worry about right now. The ground came up to meet them quicker than 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 would have liked, and the expectedly rough landing had them both grunting and disoriented, but they were alive and uninjured. For now, anyway. Are you both okay? Another concerned voice asked from nearby, and 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 looked up to spot Ieyasu and Kaminari jogging up to them. We were lucky enough to arrive near the ground, but it looked like you fell quite a distance. Yeah, I think we're good, Midoriya said, standing up and offering 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 a hand. The punk girl took it gratefully, taking a look around at the rocks and cliffs. Looks like we got dropped in the mountain area, 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 noted, peering down the rocks and crags towards the plateau, where the warp villain could still be easily seen. I hope the others are doing okay. I'm sure they'll be fine, Midoriya said with a gentle voice, tapping a fist against her shoulder lightly. Everyone in our class is strong. They'll make it back, just watch. 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 couldn't help but smile at that. Her reassurance didn't last long, however, when the sound of tumbling stones came from above her. 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗓 looked up sharply to see a wolf-like villain sneering at them from the ledge. Well, what have we here? The villain snarled gleefully, trembling in anticipation as he licked his lips. Looks like we got some kids to play with. As if on cue, more and more villains began to appear, as if from thin air. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 spotted 20 at least, before losing count, and more kept showing up. This is way more than they showed up with originally. This ain't looking so good, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 said, backing up to the rock wall behind them with a fearful expression. No shit, snarked 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 with a deadpan expression, prompting some of the villains around them to laugh or sneer. Whatever gave you that impression? The villains, maybe. Focus, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 said tensely as 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 spluttered and began whining about 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏's jabs. There will be time for banter later. Right now, we must worry about escaping these villains. Stay behind me, then. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏's gaze snapped onto Midoriya, who had taken a place in front of his three companions. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏, make weapons for 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 and 𝗔𝗪𝗧, then play defense. I'll handle these villains. The villains around them began to laugh uproariously, throwing out jeers and insults as 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 produced a pair of weapons for 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 and 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏. This brat thinks he can take all of us alone. I'd like to see him try. We'll tear him apart. I say we hold him down and make him watch as we kill his friends. No way, you can't fight them alone, 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 protested, trying to push her way past 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏, heart hammering in her chest. In spite of her efforts, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 wordlessly pushed 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 and 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 towards an alcove, where the villains would have trouble surrounding them. Midoriya, don't. You don't have to enough. Midoriya snapped, looking over his shoulder to deliver a fierce half-glare. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 could only stare at the swordsman's angry face, barely noticing the villains as they began to encroach on their group. As long as I'm alive, I won't let any of my party members die. Not ever. After a moment of silence, Midoriya let out a terrifying roar, drawing it out over several seconds as he flooded his entire body with electricity. Many of the approaching villains skidded to a halt, clearly unnerved by the swordsman's actions. The green-haired boy took the opportunity to charge, drawing both of his swords and throwing himself into the group of villains. Scary, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 whimpered as he watched Midoriya begin to fight. What's up with this guy? Try to remember. Midoriya-san spent 2 years fighting in 𝗬𝗏, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 reminded the blonde-haired boy, causing him to flinch. In spite of the swordsman's efforts, multiple villains managed to approach the trio of students in the alcove. With a single swift strike of a bow staff, the creation Quirk user managed to topple 2 villains. Midoriya ducked easily under the axe of a villain that aimed for his head, and stepped back to parry his next 2 attacks with a feral expression. The green-haired swordsman charged his black blade full of electricity, snarling viciously and pivoting past another strike to land a counter-attack, sending him to the ground in a dazed and crackling heap. More villains began breaking off from the main group, though, distracting 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 from her worries over Midoriya. Somewhere on the punk girl's left, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 yelped in horror as he barely managed to dodge a villain's punch. That was way too close, the blonde-haired boy screamed, not even bothering to try and use the stun baton that 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 made for him. Would you quit whining? 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏's eye twitched at 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏's behavior. She sympathized with him. They weren't prepared for a situation like this at all, but there was only so much 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 could take before 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 started to grate on her nerves. We won't get out of this at all if you don't even try to fight, you know. That's the problem, I don't know how to fight, 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 yelled, comically waving his baton around in the air. My quirk can't be used at range without hitting you guys, and I don't know what to do with this thing at all. Oh, for fuck's sake. Maybe try hitting someone with it, 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 retorted, before finally giving up and kicking 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 back into the villain that was chasing him. Just as the blonde boy was about to yell at her angrily, the villain grabbed him, only for his electrification to lock the villain into place. Oh, it works. I can be helpful. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 just rolled her eyes as 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 grinned happily back at her, his mood turning around completely. As if to add to the nonsense, 2 more villains joined in with their own attacks, not realizing that they'd also be stuck in the blonde boy's electricity field. Seeing another group of villains approach, 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 lowered one of her jacks and plugged into her boot, blasting them all with the amplified sounds of her heartbeats. Most of them were sent to the ground, clutching their heads in pain, and the few that remained were trapped by a net thrown by the creation Quirk user. Focus, both of you, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 snapped, brandishing her bow staff at the villains that continued to break away from Midoriya's attention. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 shot a glance towards the green-haired swordsman, and her worries died down another notch as she saw him still fighting on. Behind you, 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 dashed forward at the warning, turning to watch a villain pummel the ground where the punk girl was just standing. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 took advantage of the opening, however, and struck that villain over the head with her bow staff, knocking him out cold. It's ready, 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 called, leaning low to the ground, her back arched up. 𝗘𝗁𝗧𝗏 and 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 shared a confused glance as the skin under 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏's costume glowed brightly, before exploding outward and upward to reveal a large blanket that descended to cover both of the girls. 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗏 peeked out from under the blanket to give a knowing smile to 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏. It's an insulation sheet, over 100 millimeters thick. Oh, I see, Kaminari said with an eager grin, generating as much electricity as he could. The blonde boy cast his arms outward and unleashed the full potential of his electricity. Indiscriminate shock, 3 million volts. The entire area lit up bright yellow for several moments as every villain was shocked by Kaminari's electricity. Once the sound of villains hitting the ground reached her ears, 𝗬𝗁𝗏 poked her head out from under the blanket to survey the damage. Damn, he got pretty much all of them. They're good as new. 𝗧𝗎𝗎 sighed as she stepped out of the blanket, adjusting a strap as she saw 𝗬𝗁𝗏's confused expression. Oh, creating something that big destroyed my costume, so I made a new one. 𝗬𝗁𝗏 hummed in response, ignoring a pang of jealousy as she eyed 𝗧𝗎𝗎's body for a moment. Way. The pair of girls turned to see Kaminari in the aftermath of his all-out attack. 𝗬𝗁𝗏 snickered as she watched the blonde boy walk around with a derpy expression, flashing a pair of thumbs up. Ah, he went all out, eh? Midoriya's voice came from behind, causing 𝗬𝗁𝗏 to jump and turn sharply to face the green-haired swordsman. He was breathing heavily, and was smoking a little bit, but seemed fine otherwise. Are you guys okay? I think I should be asking you that, 𝗬𝗁𝗏 countered, her eye twitching when Midoriya just chuckled in response. I'm fine, don't worry. Midoriya smiled at 𝗬𝗁𝗏 amusedly, before his gaze turned serious. You two should lead Kaminari back to the entrance plateau. What about you, Midoriya-san? 𝗧𝗎𝗎𝗎 asked with a worried expression. Surely you don't intend to continue fighting. Midoriya was silent as he turned to survey the area. Explosions could be heard in the distance, and 𝗬𝗁𝗏 was sure the ship in the shipwreck zone was sinking. The punk girl stared at Midoriya for a moment, trying to come up with a reason for him not to go, but decided against it. She was sure he'd just ignore it anyway. Just don't die, 𝗬𝗁𝗏 said in a low voice, barely able to look the swordsman in the eye. Midoriya held her gaze for a long moment, before nodding with a determined expression. Without another word, he turned and left, leaping from the cliff and gliding down. 𝗬𝗁𝗏 just watched him go, hating the tight feeling in her chest. Aside from Kaminari's all-out attack, Midoriya had done all the heavy lifting in that fight, and now the punk girl could only stare at his back as he ran off to fight some more. With a frustrated sigh, 𝗬𝗁𝗏 turned and took Kaminari by the wrist, setting off towards the plateau. Fuck off. Katsuki let off a medium-sized explosion, blasting a slimy villain into the far wall. Behind her came the sounds of Kirishima using his hardening to break down a villain's defense, then knock them out entirely. Letting out a deep breath, the ashen blonde girl relaxed out of her combat stance, taking a moment to look around at the desolated zone. Was that all of them? Kirishima asked, letting his hardening drop. They're so weak. I wouldn't have expected guys like these to attack UA. Probably just fodder to keep us busy. Katsuki snarked with a low growl, wandering over to the window to try and establish an escape route. Well, I guess it doesn't matter. We should probably go look for the others. For a moment, an image of Deku appeared in Katsuki's mind, but she shook it off and schooled her thoughts back into line. You can hold your own rescue party by yourself, Katsuki grunted, prompting a surprised look from the red-haired boy beside her. I've got a rematch with that warp guy, and then I'll kill everyone else with him too. Are you serious? Kirishima asked, staring at Katsuki as if she'd grown a second head. Neither of us could do any damage to the warp guy. His fog is too shut-it. Katsuki interrupted, glaring hotly at the hardening quirk user. Warp guy's their ticket out of here. We take him out, they're all stuck. Kirishima could only stare dumbly at the ashen blonde girl. Katsuki just rolled her eyes and left the room, hearing the footsteps of the red-haired boy following behind her moments later. Thought you were gonna go have a rescue party, Katsuki said as they stepped out onto the street. And let you get killed by those villains? Not very manly, bro. Katsuki just rolled her eyes again. It was clear to her that Kirishima didn't agree with their course of action, so she had to wonder why he'd decide to follow her like this. Deciding it wasn't worth the effort at the moment, Katsuki let it drop. It made her feel uneasy, walking around a destroyed and empty city area. Once they'd left the building they'd been dropped in, there are no more villains at all. Katsuki could only think the villains were looking down on them, assuming that such a small force would be enough for the two heroes in training. It's way too quiet out here, Kirishima remarked as they came to the edge of the ruined cityscape. Katsuki surveyed their surroundings again, spotting the main courtyard where the main villain group had shown up. The ashen blonde girl picked up the pace, leaping over rocks and ducking past trees as a pit slowly formed in her gut. As they arrived at a ledge overlooking the courtyard, Katsuki motioned for Kirishima to get low. Together, the two of them crouched near a large rock, getting a view of the situation. With a sick feeling in her stomach, Katsuki saw a large muscled villain holding down Aizawa-sensei, and that her teacher's arms both seemed to be mutilated. Off to the side, the warp villain appeared, and exchanged words with a villain covered in hands. Katsuki couldn't tell what either of them were saying. Is that Tsu-chan? Kirishima whispered, grabbing Katsuki's attention as he pointed to the edge of the water on the far side of the courtyard. Looks like she's alone. Just as Kirishima said, Katsuki could see the frog girl peeking her head up out of the water. The ashen blonde kept tabs on Asuie as the conversation between villains got more and more heated. Suddenly, the hand villain went still and slouched over. What do you think they're talking about? I can't hear them, Kirishima mumbled, wringing his hands in anticipation. Probably something stupid, Katsuki snapped in a low voice. She kept looking between the villains, her teacher, and her frog-faced classmate. If Katsuki messed up even slightly in her assault, someone was sure to get hurt or killed. Before she had a chance to consider a plan, however, the hand's villain blurred and disappeared. Su-chan, Kirishima whisper shouted, and Katsuki looked over sharply to see the hand's villain looming over her classmate menacingly. Nothing immediately happened, though, and Katsuki saw her teacher's head raised up and pointed in Asuie's direction. He must have erased the villain's quirk, whatever it is. Ignoring her red-haired companion's protests, Katsuki launched herself off her perch with a loud explosion, drawing the attention of all the villains in the vicinity. Using a small explosion to soften her landing, Katsuki blew away a number of small fry villains and dashed towards the edge of the water, making a beeline directly for Asuie. Katsuki gathered all her strength and prepared as big of an explosion as she could manage. As she reared her open hand back to launch it, however, the hand's villain blurred out of sight, leaving Katsuki no choice but to cancel her attack. Bakugo-chan, Asuie called from behind Katsuki. But the ashen blonde girl said nothing, only holding an arm out, as if to shield the frog girl from harm. Katsuki's glare hardened as she faced off against the four apparent leaders of the villain group. Well, what's this? The hand's villain drawled from where he'd appeared, standing close to the muscled villain, fingers scratching at his flaky neck. Another kid shows up out of nowhere. And here I just wanted to smash some of All Might's pride. We should hurry, Shigaraki Tamura, the warp villain said urgently. As I told you, that student escaped. The heroes will be here soon. Quiet, Shigaraki snapped, turning to glare hotly at the warp villain. You let that student escape. You're lucky to be a warp gate, otherwise you'd be dust right now. The warp villain made a frustrated sound, but said nothing as Shigaraki turned back to Katsuki and Asuie. Now then, Shigaraki scratched at his neck as he eyed up the pair of students. Just looking at him made Katsuki's skin crawl. An explosion quirk could be trouble. Namu, the muscled villain, Namu, made a warbling sound and stood up, leaving Aizawa's body behind. Hey now, don't be like that, piped up an eager voice from behind Shigaraki. The hooded villain stepped up, brandishing a sizable dagger. Cuties like them shouldn't be smashed into the ground like a racerhead, you know. I think they deserve something special. Katsuki almost shuddered right then. Out of all these villains, this hooded one creeped her out the most. Shigaraki chuckled for a moment, before calling Namu back. By all means, help yourself. The hooded villain started giggling, then devolved into hysterical laughter as he brandished his dagger. Before Katsuki could react, that dagger was embedded in her shoulder, searing pain spreading outward in every direction. She let out a large explosion instinctively, only for it to come out far smaller than she intended. What the hell? Barely aware of Asuie's panic behind her, Katsuki tried to prepare another explosion, only to find that her arm wasn't moving. Now panicking herself, Katsuki tried in vain to move, only to find herself on the ground, unable to move at all. She shot a frenzied look at the hooded villain, who was enjoying every second of the sight before him. One down, the villain crowed, crouching down over Katsuki's paralyzed form. She could barely make out another dagger in his hands, poised and ready to strike. And don't you move, Miss Frog. Unless, of course, you think Blondie here shouldn't make it. He started laughing hysterically again as Asuie made a fearful noise from the water behind Katsuki. The ashen blonde girl wanted to retort, to tell the villain to fuck off or kill himself. But even her vocal cords didn't seem to want to work. Katsuki wondered idly why Kirishima hadn't made his presence known yet. She could only guess he didn't want to make things worse, just as Katsuki had held back for the same reason before. Barely able to look up, Katsuki noticed the hood villain fish a high-pressure syringe out of his coat. Ah, the last dose, the hooded villain said forlornly, holding it up and inspecting it. Sucks in, something or other, whatever. Anyone injected with this stuff will die of heart failure, and it'll be completely untraceable. He started giggling like a madman again, and Katsuki's blood ran cold. I can't fucking die like that. Katsuki could only feel dread, unable to move as the syringe came down, the villain laughing hysterically all the while. No, stop. I still have to be a hero. Katsuki's eyes screwed shut as her mental pleas went unheard. In her panic, Katsuki could no longer hear sounds. Help me, Izuku. A moment passed, then another. The panic faded. Slowly, 𝗧𝗂𝘁 opened her eyes. In front of her face was the syringe, cracked open, its contents seeping into the concrete. What? A black boot came down in front of her, and 𝗧𝗂𝘁 looked up to see Izuku crouched over her, lightning crackling up and down his arms. His crystal white sword was pointed at the hooded villain that was now some yards away, shaking with rage. You really came. Distantly, 𝗧𝗂𝘁 became aware of sounds again. Izuku stood up, and while part of her wanted him to stay close, she immediately realized why he'd moved. As the green-haired swordsman took a step forward away from her, 𝗧𝗂𝘁 was hefted up, with Kirishima and Isui on either side of her. Black Swordsman, the hooded villain ground out, gripping his dagger so hard that it appeared to be shaking. What the hell are you doing here, Midoku? I could ask you the same thing, Johnny Black, Izuku retorted calmly, but 𝗧𝗂𝘁 could see the hell written on the swordsman's face. Then again, you're with a villain group. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Midoriya, you know that guy? Kirishima asked, looking confused as usual. On the far side of the courtyard, Shigaraki and Kirigiri shared a confused glance as well. I'll explain later, Izuku said, his gaze held in front of him. Su-chan, grab Aizawa-sensei. I'll cover you. 𝗧𝗂𝘁 watched as Isui carefully approached their fallen teacher, grabbing him from a distance with her extended tongue, and beating a hasty retreat. The hooded villain, Johnny Black, tried multiple times to throw daggers at the frog-like girl, only for every dagger to be zapped out of the air by Izuku. 𝗧𝗂𝘁 barely registered that she couldn't follow any of the daggers with her eyes, but she enjoyed the clanging sound they made as they hit the ground. Damn it all! Johnny screamed as he charged Izuku, a dagger in each hand. The green-haired swordsman readied himself for combat. But a large explosion at the entrance plateau stopped everyone in their tracks. All eyes turned to the entrance, and out of the smoke came the one person capable of saving them. It's fine now. Kirishima started cheering as Isui let out a croak of relief, and even Izuku couldn't help but shoot a small grin up to the plateau. Why? It was a little different for 𝗧𝗂𝘁, somehow. Despite the relief at knowing this was all almost over, 𝗧𝗂𝘁 didn't have room in her heart for two saviors, so close together like this. I am here. All Might delivered his iconic line. And as her tears began to fall, 𝗧𝗂𝘁 could only wonder why Izuku's appearance had made a larger impact than the #1 hero. Ah, we're getting a continue, Shigaraki said gleefully, drawing Aijiru's attention away from the plateau. I've been waiting for you, hero. All Might remained still for a moment, before disappearing completely. In a flash, the #1 hero appeared at the courtyard, standing protectively in front of Midoriya. And the others, many villains along his path falling over in unconscious heaps. I am sorry, children, All Might said. I was held up by the principal, though I should have been here at the start. The large man trailed off, sighing deeply as he shook off the train of thought. It's okay now, All Might, Midoriya said, grinning up at the #1 hero. It's like you said, you're here now. That's what counts, right? The two of them shared a look, and All Might grinned back. Indeed it is, young Midoriya, All Might said, now back to his usual gusto. All of you, head to the entrance. I've cleared a path for you. Aijiru and Isui gave their confirmations. But the red-haired boy stopped short when he noticed that Midoriya wasn't following them. Oi, Midoriya, Aijiru called, prompting a look from the green-haired swordsman. That means you too, right? Not this time, Kirishima-kun, Midoriya responded, stepping up to All Might's side resolutely. I'm staying to fight. I gave you an order, young Midoriya. All Might gave his protege a stern look. One that I can't obey. Sorry, All Might. I need to do this. I cannot in good conscience, All Might started, but Midoriya held up a hand to silence him. I won't be in the way, I promise, Midoriya said, shooting his predecessor an apologetic look. Johnny Black is the only one I plan to fight. I promised I would. And what promise would that be? The promise to help take down Death Gun. Silence reigned in the courtyard as everyone, villains and heroes alike, waited for what would come next. Understanding dawned on All Might's face, and he resigned himself to allow his pupil's wish. Aijiru, not really understanding what was going on, readjusted his grip on Bakugo as he made to leave. Kirishima-kun, Midoriya called, pulling the red-haired boy's attention back. Be careful with her. Knowing this guy, that dagger is probably poison. Aijiru gritted his teeth and nodded his confirmation to Midoriya, before turning to leave. Isui was already ahead of him, already nearing the stairs across the courtyard. Once the red-haired boy had gotten a fair distance, he was stopped by Bakugo groaning and trying to talk. Stop. Need to watch. The ashen blonde girl slurred, struggling to try and turn them around. Aijiru wanted to try and talk sense into the girl, to make her understand how dangerous it was about to be, but was stopped when he saw a pair of tear tracks streaking down her cheeks. You're bleeding too badly to stay and watch, Aijiru said, prompting a strangled noise from the normally angry girl. And you got poisoned. That's more important than anything. It didn't take much to figure out what had the girl so upset. Aijiru had guessed that Bakugo and Midoriya had some kind of past. And even if they weren't so close at present, it was obvious they still cared about each other. It broke 𝗎𝗎𝗎's heart to have to drag Bakugo away from Midoriya, no matter how much she needed it. Shigaraki Tamura was equal parts confused, irritated, ecstatic. He didn't understand what was going on between Johnny Black and the child he'd called Black Swordsman. Tamura had read forum posts about the hero of Aincrad, but he'd never expected that person to be a child in their first year of high school, and 2 years after 𝗬 had been cleared to boot. 𝗬 survivors were reported to be an odd bunch, and the few that tried to reacclimate in society usually failed. Seeing one as a hero student, at U, and no less, was perplexing. Tamura would have to remember to ask Johnny about him later. Tamura was irritated because of a student's apparent escape. The entire plan hinged on them keeping the children at the USJ contained, so that they could kill All Might in peace. And then 𝗬𝗁𝗎 had fucked that right up, by allowing himself to be overpowered by a handful of tiny babies. It made Tamura furious, even more so that 𝗬𝗁𝗎 was their ticket out of there, and so was exempt from punishment. The villain pushed those thoughts out of his mind for now, though. The symbol of peace himself was here, now. They'd have a short window to get the job done, though. Tamura hated timed missions, but this was too important to let go. Let's clear this and go home, Shigaraki said gleefully, scratching at the rash on his neck. Nomiu, responding to his command. Nomiu charged with all its strength, warbling oddly as it launched a powerful assault. All Might leaned back away from the attack, striking Nomiu in the gut with his own powerful punch, only to discover that nothing happened. No effect, huh? All Might remarked, stepping back away from Nomiu to reposition. As the #1 hero began punching Namu's face, he seemed rather confused over that strategy not working either. It's because of his shock absorption, Tamura commented, gloating over Namu's superiority. If you want to damage Namu, you'd have to carve out his flesh bit by bit, but that isn't very heroic. Thanks for the info, All Might said, flashing Tamura a quick thumbs up. The Hands villain rolled his eyes at that, biting back a retort as the muscled hero danced around behind Namu, putting his arms around the massive villain's waist. All Might pulled with all his strength, causing a massive dust cloud to erupt as he suplexed the villain. As the dust cloud covered the area, Tamura took a moment to look back at the other fight at hand. Johnny Black was engaged in a fierce battle with the Black Swordsman, Midoku. Tamura watched with mild interest as the two 𝗬 survivors exchanged blows, each strike flying faster than the Hands villain could properly follow. He suspected it was only Sensei's training that let him see the blurs, and that made it all the more impressive to behold. Midoku parried another flying dagger, and Johnny used the opening to launch another series of strikes. The green-haired swordsman seemed to keep up with relative ease, however, which only seemed to exacerbate the sack-faced villain's anger. "You've ruined everything," Johnny screamed as he swiped at Midoku's neck, letting out another cry of frustration as the hero student leaned back to dodge. "My precious poison, I waited so long for the perfect occasion." "You need psychological help," Midoku retorted, breathing heavily and creating an electrical shockwave to send Johnny flying. 𝗧𝗧 and his brother are already getting treatment. It isn't too late for you to do the same." That only seemed to make Johnny even more angry. From where he stood, Tamura could see the sack-faced villain's eye grow more and more red. "Keep this up, little hero, and you'll make him use his quirk." As the fight between 𝗬 survivors raged on, the dust cloud began to die out. As the dust fell away completely, it was revealed that Namu had not been stuck in concrete like All Might intended. Instead, a portal had been opened, and Namu had reached through to dig his claws into the symbol of peace's side. "Ha, you won't be able to stop him like that, idiot hero," Tamura gloated. "Namu was made to be as strong as you know." Watching All Might struggle in their grip was equal parts irritating and enjoyable. Tamura enjoyed seeing such a powerful hero in pain right before him, but it still made him angry that All Might believed he could get out of this and win the day. "𝗬𝗁𝗎," Tamura commanded, scratching at his neck. Wordlessly, the warp villain began to pull All Might through the gate, and prepared to close it on him part way through. He wouldn't get the chance to follow through, however, as Midoku sent a small barrage of lightning bolts across the courtyard. Only one of those bolts connected with 𝗬𝗁𝗎's mechanical bracing, but it was enough to stun him temporarily, causing the already existing portal to close on Namu instead, disconnecting his upper and lower halves from each other. Before Namu had a chance to recover, a wave of ice appeared and encased both of Namu's halves completely, along with Johnny's entire body up to his neck. With only the muscled villain's claws exposed, All Might was able to break free of his bindings and leap away from the villain group. "Young Todoroki," All Might called as all eyes turned to the young half-and-half hero student. "The symbol of peace can't be killed by the likes of you lot," Todoroki intoned in a bland voice. "I guess we're in a pinch, then, huh?" Tamura started giggling as he looked around at the situation. Midoku moved away from Johnny's frozen form and incoherent screaming to stand above 𝗬𝗁𝗎's stunned form, electricity crackling to keep the warp villain from moving. "I could see that metal casing from across the courtyard," Midoku commented, laying the tip of one of his swords against that same metal with a wry grin. Metal and electricity go well together, but not for anyone connected to that metal. Kids these days, they'll make the league look bad. Instead of commenting, Tumura just called out to 𝗵𝗃. The muscled villain warbled again as it broke free of its icy prison. All Might and his fledgling students watched in horror as fleshy tendrils appeared from the exposed interior of 𝗵𝗃's body, pulling the two halves back together and regenerating the damage. So his quirk isn't shock absorption? All Might asked rhetorically, thoroughly disgusted by what he had just witnessed. I didn't say that was all he had, did I? Tumura said with a giggle, scratching at his neck again as he watched 𝗵𝗃 put himself back together. 𝗵𝗃's been modified to take you on at your strongest. Now, I think we'll be taking our gate back. 𝗵𝗃 broke out into a sprint, charging directly at Midoku. Tumura enjoyed the look of shock on the swordsman's face, as well as the panic displayed by the #1 hero. Before anyone else could react, 𝗵𝗃 had reached its target and kicked up yet another large dust cloud with its attack. Midoriya Todoroki called into the dust cloud, but was surprised to see his classmate sitting right next to him, where he wasn't a second ago. How'd you move that fast? I didn't, Midoku let out with a groan as he stood up. All Might got to me before 𝗵𝗃 did. A pair of rutted skid marks were now present in the place where Midoku and Kurogiri had been. And as the dust cloud settled, it was revealed that those skid marks were from All Might's feet digging and after blocking 𝗵𝗃's attack. I guess you don't know how to hold back, huh? All Might commented, breathing deeply in his protective stance, a single track of blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. I had to rescue my companions, what do you expect? Tumura spat, scratching at his neck as the villain group reformed. Across from them, All Might seemed barely able to stand, and his two fledgling students took up positions on either side of the #1 hero. Besides, that explosion girl earlier tried to blow me up. Violence for the sake of protecting people makes it okay, right hero? I don't think it counts for villains who just want to destroy and murder, Midoku commented with a glare, his electricity running up and down arms. And that's what makes me so angry, Tumura exclaimed, pointing a finger at Midoku for emphasis. This world takes the same acts and decides whether they're right or wrong, even if there's no difference at all. Ridiculous, All Might said, dropping out of his combat stance. The context is what makes these acts right or wrong. Fighting to protect is not the same as fighting to destroy. Tumura made a frustrated sound at the symbol of peace's declaration, then gave up on arguing the point entirely. It was clear to him that the world of light would never truly understand his or sensei's will. 𝗵𝗃, Kurogiri, deal with All Might. Johnny and I will handle the children. Tumura readied himself to fight, and as he began his charge, a sudden presence made itself known. All Might, looking more intense than Tumura had ever seen him, began to charge at the villain group. Before either side could react, 𝗵𝗃 charged past Tumura to meet All Might's fist head-on, causing an intense shockwave that blasted everyone back. As the hero and villain traded blows, Johnny Black broke free of his ice prison and charged at Midoku, who took the opportunity to charge right back. What intense power, Kurogiri exclaimed from his place next to Tumura. I can't get near them at all. If your quirk isn't shock nullification, but absorption instead, then there must be a limit, right? All Might yelled as he traded blows with 𝗵𝗃, dodging and weaving through what attacks he could. The #1 hero rained endless punches against his villainous enemy. Even taking a hit directly to his weak spot only marshaled the hero's resolve, and forced him to redouble his efforts. Every strike from either hero or villain caused the terrain around them to warp and change. Elsewhere, Johnny's eyes were glowing bright red, and every attack he took from Midoku's lighting or swords seemed to make him fight harder. Midoku ducked under a pair of swipes from the hooded villain, and retaliated with the tip of his sword to the villain's neck. Even as Johnny let out a retching sound, he let fly another pair of flying daggers, forcing his electrical opponent to dance away in order to dodge completely. Stop this, Johnny, Midoku called, parrying and dodging through the attacks he could. It was becoming apparent to Tumura that the Black Swordsman wasn't keeping up as well as he was before. Don't patronize me, Midoku, Johnny screamed, his eyes glowing brighter and brighter with every passing second. I'll get revenge on you for what you stole from me. How are you this pissed off over a single kill? It's not just about this. The two 𝗬𝗏 survivors stopped fighting for a moment to stare each other down. You stole everything from me, Johnny yelled, pointing a dagger at Midoku. You took down my friends in 𝗬𝗏, followed them to 𝗔𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗏. Laughing Coffin was the only place I ever felt welcome, and you stole that from me. Laughing Coffin is a guild of murderers, Johnny. How can you expect anyone to react any differently? Midoku shot back, growing more angry by the second. How many times have I watched your friends kill innocent people? How many of my own friends have I had to save from you? Talk all you want, but whatever revenge you claim is mine by default. Johnny just screamed in frustration again, and the fight was back on. Back on the other side of the courtyard, the fight between All Might and 𝗵𝗃 was heating up to an incredible degree. Made to fight me, All Might growled, eyes burning with intense resolve, the concrete and trees around the duo being ripped up and scattered with every single punch. If you can withstand me at 100%, then I'll just defeat you from far beyond that. With every passing second, and even as the villain continued hailing punches, it was clear that 𝗵𝗲 was being pushed back, putting everything he had into a haymaker. All Might sent 𝗵𝗲 flying backwards, tumbling and bouncing along the ruined concrete. Without any hesitation, the number one hero leapt after the villain, passing through the trees without any resistance at all to meet another head-on punch from the bioengineered villain. A hero can always break out of a pinch. 𝗕𝗫𝗄's eyes narrowed as All Might and 𝗵𝗲 traded attacks and positions with startling frequency, dancing around each other in their intense fight. Leaping into the air, All Might latched onto 𝗵𝗲's arm and pulled, twisting around and launching the muscled villain into the ground at an incredibly high speed. 𝗵𝗲 bounced out of the crater caused by its landing as All Might landed in an intimidating crouch pose. "Hey villain, have you ever heard these words?" All Might stood and reared back an intense punch, the fire in his eyes burning to the 1000th degree. "Go beyond, plus ultra." Delivering the punch, 𝗵𝗲 didn't appear to move for a moment, only to fly off at a speed faster than 𝗕𝗫𝗄 was able to follow. Only moments later, the entire building shook and reverberated as 𝗵𝗲 shot through the dome, flying far off into the sky. And so the dust finally settled, revealing a haggard-looking All Might, still posing from the aftermath of his powerful attack. "I really have gotten weaker," All Might commented, slowly pushing himself back up to stand tall in the face of his victory. "No way, he hasn't gotten any weaker at all," 𝗕𝗫𝗄 ground out, scratching furiously at his neck. "Did he lie to me? Something the matter?" All Might taunted, not moving from his intimidating pose. "Not coming. I thought you wanted to clear this, or whatever." 𝗕𝗫𝗄 just glared hotly at the number one hero, fear and rage battling within him. After watching All Might tear down his 𝗵𝗲, 𝗕𝗫𝗄 was almost scared to try and fight now, but he was also incredibly pissed off at All Might too. He couldn't decide which of these two primal emotions to feed. Glancing off to the side, 𝗕𝗫𝗄 watched as Johnny kept up his battle with Midoku, fruitlessly trying to cut down the swordsman that had apparently wronged him. "Shigaraki 𝗕𝗫𝗄," Kurogiri called from his side. "We can still win this if we work together. All Might does appear to be weakened, and we still have underlings we can use. We must." "No." 𝗕𝗫𝗄 raised a hand to push Kurogiri back. Oh, how he loathed to admit it, but he was certain they'd lost this time. "Johnny, get over here. We're leaving." "What?" Johnny screeched, dodging another of Midoku's attacks to shoot his boss a frenzied look. "What do I mean, leaving? It's game over," 𝗕𝗫𝗄 said, motioning at the sack-faced villain to regroup. Johnny growled intensely, but complied and returned to 𝗕𝗫𝗄's side. "Don't you forget, Black Swordsman," Johnny yelled, throwing his last dagger at Midoku, who parried it easily. "I'll have my revenge next time." All Might made no moves to stop their departure. In some small part of his mind, 𝗕𝗫𝗄 wondered if he made the right decision, but without 𝗵𝗲 as a party member, he couldn't afford to take that risk. The Hands villain stared down the number one hero, as Johnny Black and Midoku faced off. As the darkness of Kurogiri's quirk enveloped the villain party, 𝗕𝗫𝗄 left the heroes with one parting message. "We failed this time, but we'll definitely kill you later. Symbol of peace, All Might. Prepare yourself." And then the villains were gone. It was only moments after the villain leaders disappeared that the hero team arrived from UA, with 𝗳𝗏𝗍𝗄 announcing his return. All Might and I shared a sigh of relief as the heroes set out to capture all the remaining villains and gather up the students that had been scattered by Kurogiri's warp attack. It didn't take very long after that for Todoroki and I to be corralled up to the entrance, leaving All Might alone to talk with 𝗵𝗲𝗄-sensei. I'd been worried, of course, but All Might gave a grin and thumbs up, so I put it out of my mind and left. After what felt like an eternity, I stepped out of the USJ building. There were police cars and ambulances lined up on the curb, waiting for anyone that might need them. Todoroki didn't bother waiting for me as he rejoined the class. For no particular reason, I took a moment to survey the area. Bakugo could be seen sitting on the back bumper of an ambulance, staring into space as she was attended by an EMT. Aside from her and myself, the entire class was grouped up around a familiar detective. There was so much I wanted to do right then, but I decided on a course of action that took precedence. "Detective 𝗧𝗏𝗁," I called, pulling his and my classmates' attention to myself. My friends crowded around me, and just about everyone in the class had something to say about my arrival just then. It was with a heavy heart that I put my hands up to silence them, smiling apologetically as I kept myself in work mode. "Well, Midoriya-kun, I wish I could say I was happy to see you," 𝗧𝗏𝗁 commented with an apologetic smile, prompting looks of confusion from my classmates. "It's okay, 𝗧𝗏𝗁-san," I returned with my own small smile. "I'm glad you're here, regardless. I have an update for you." 𝗧𝗏𝗁 took me aside, and I filled him in on Johnny Black's appearance, reporting his possession of the drug he stole from the hospital. Thankfully, I'd overheard it was his last dose, and I was even more grateful that I'd been able to destroy it. It's unfortunate that he appeared here, 𝗧𝗵𝗄𝗁 commented, writing in his notepad. Good work depriving him of the drug, though. It seems you spared 𝗵𝗃𝗁 from a grisly fate. I should have been there faster, I lamented, raking a hand through my hair again. Johnny was still able to get her with one of his poisoned daggers. Thankfully, it was a minor injury. With an equally minor poison, 𝗧𝗵𝗄𝗁 consoled me. I'm sure you saw already, but 𝗵𝗃𝗁 has already recovered full motor function, and her shoulder injury has already been completely healed. Aside from the teachers, hers was the only injury today. Speaking of which, how is Aizawa-sensei? I asked, rejoining my class so that everyone could hear the news. Both of his arms, as well as his skull, suffered severe fractures, 𝗧𝗵𝗄𝗁 reported, prompting a notion of despair in the class. Thankfully, there doesn't appear to be any form of brain damage. His eyes may suffer from the damage, however. As for 13, the damage looked worse than it actually was. There were lacerations on their back and upper arms, but the medics predict a full recovery. 𝗧𝗵𝗄𝗁 continued to relay information to the rest of the class. So I took a moment to slip away. Part of me wanted to go see 𝗵𝗃𝗁, but I wouldn't get a chance, as the sound of a vehicle driving up pulled my attention. I watched as a familiar-looking car came to a stop at the curb, with an equally familiar pair of people bursting out of their doors. Midoku-kun. Before I could react, Asuna had her arms around me. Only a moment later, my mom was there too, the pair of them both holding on for dear life. Hey, I'm okay. I consoled them, resting a hand on the tops of their heads. But you could have died, Asuna exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes as she looked up at me. What else is new? I joked, only to be met with Asuna's trademark second-in-command glare. Seriously though, it was a bunch of small-time villains. Only a couple of them were really dangerous, and I had All Might with me by the time I got to them. Asuna's glare softened at that, but didn't go away completely. Mom, for her part, hadn't moved from where she was holding on at all. I almost lost you once, Mom said, her voice muffled from where her face was pressed into my coat. You were gone for so long, but I came back, I consoled, stroking the back of her head as the tears began to well up in my own eyes as well. Back then, and today too. I'm still here. The three of us shared tearful smiles and hugged again. With a quick glance at Detective 𝗧𝗵𝗄𝗁, just to make sure it was all right, we pulled apart and made to leave. Despite closing this first chapter on my heroics career, I had a feeling that this was only the beginning.